Number 5. Who is John Doe 29? In April 2015, the FBI released this picture of a man who they are calling John Doe 29. In the picture, the man is holding a young girl. Sadly, this picture was found in a series of photos where the girl in the picture is being sexually abused by another unidentified man. The FBI is not accusing the man in the picture of being involved with the sexual abuse, but they believe he may have information about the girl and her abuser. What is known is that the picture was taken before January 2008 because that's when the pictures came to the attention of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The man in the picture, who is likely between the ages of 30 and 45, is wearing a unique silver ring on his ring finger on his left hand. This ring is similar to a ring that the abuser wears, but he wears it on his right hand. The man is also wearing a white, black, and red shirt that has writing and/or a design on the sleeve. As for the victim, she has blonde hair and she is wearing white Nike sneakers with a black swoosh. Unfortunately, the FBI doesn't know where in the world the picture was taken, meaning the girl and her abuser could be anywhere. The FBI is hoping that someone will recognize the man or the ring and they will notify them because they fear that the girl still may be in danger. Number 4. The murder of Ali Surmas. On January 26, 1986, the bullet-ridden body of 44-year-old Ali Surmas was pulled out of the Darling River near Wentworth, Australia. The disabled pensioner and the father of 4 had been shot once above each eye, in the back of the head, and several times in the body. Surmas went missing 3 days before his body was found. He was last seen outside of a post office in the city of Merbein, which is about 30 miles away from where his body was pulled out of the river. Eyewitnesses remember seeing Surmas because he was arguing with a man and 2 women. Eyewitnesses were able to give a description of the man and the 2 women and the car they were driving, which was a green Holden HQ with a white roof. Another person that the police are looking for is the man in this picture. This picture was found in the glove box of Surmas's car, and his friends and family have no idea who the man in the picture is. The police have no information about the man, but they would like to speak to him because police believe that Surmas may have been kidnapped by someone he knew. What the police don't know is why Surmas was executed in such a brutal fashion. He didn't have any enemies and he didn't have any links to organized crime. The police are hoping that one of the 3 people that Surmas argued with on the day he went missing, or the person in the picture, will come forward and hopefully shed light on this 30-year-old mystery. Number 3. Who is the El Dorado Jane Doe? In June 1991, the police were called to a seedy motel in El Dorado, Arkansas. In one of the rooms, they found an exotic dancer named Mercedes dead from a gunshot. Mercedes' ex-boyfriend, James McElphin, was arrested and convicted of the murder. Now, here's where the mystery starts. When the police looked in Mercedes' purse, they found a piece of identification issued in Arkansas with Mercedes' picture and the name Cheryl Ann Wick. The police tracked her family down in Minneapolis and called her parents. That's when they learned that the real Cheryl Ann Wick was alive and well. It's believed that Mercedes stole Wick's identity when they worked together at a strip club in Minneapolis. So if Mercedes wasn't really Cheryl Ann Wick, then who was she? Over 25 years later, the police still do not know the real identity of the woman they call the El Dorado Jane Doe. The police have several pictures of her, including the ones on the screen now. They also have fingerprints and her DNA, but even with all that information, they do not even know how old she is, let alone her identity. They believe that she was somewhere between the ages of 20 and 30 when she died. She was 5'10", 162 pounds, and she had old scars over her right eye and her left waist. In her possession, they found menus from restaurants in Texas and Virginia. She also had a diary, and she refers to 2 people named Tyrone and Gail. Finally, she had a Bible inscribed with several names in it. All of them had the last name Stroud. Besides using the name Cheryl Ann Wick, the El Dorado Jane Doe also used the names Cheryl Kaufman, Shannon Wiley, Sharon Wiley, Kelly Lee Carr, and Kelly Carr. The man who killed her also said that she used the name Helen Stenner and that she was from Oklahoma. There has been rampant speculation about why the El Dorado Jane Doe stole Wick's identity and started a new life, like she was a prostitute on the run from an organized crime syndicate. It's also possible that she was a mother. Before she was murdered, she told a friend that she had 2 children and at least one of them was a girl. Supposedly when she was murdered, her children were living with her mother. The police are still hoping to identify the El Dorado Jane Doe so that they can give her family, if she has any, some closure. Number 2. The murder of Eva K. Wennell. On May 1, 2008, 6-year-old Eva K. Wennell was having lunch with her husband of 20 years. When he returned home after work later that evening to their upscale home in Lawrence, Georgia, he found Kay dead in a pool of her own blood on the kitchen floor. Kay most likely encountered her killer in the foyer of her home. That's where she was punched hard enough in the face to cause blood to splatter. Kay was then chased to the kitchen where her throat was slit. The coroner determined that she was murdered several hours before she was found. There was no signs of forced entry and nothing in the house was stolen, so police believe that Kay was murdered over something personal. That made the obvious suspect her husband, but he was quickly cleared as a suspect. The next logical conclusion was that if it wasn't her husband, Kay could have been killed by someone she was having an affair with. Supporting that theory was a letter that was sent to the newspaper, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, several weeks after the murder. The letter was written using letters cut from a magazine. It read, "I loved her. She said that we could be together. She told me that she hated her house and that fat, miserable, lying husband. She said that she loved me, but that was a lie too. I told her this would happen if she didn't keep her promises to me. His money was more important than our love. We could have been so happy together." The police are unsure if the letter is actually from the killer or just a disturbing prank. Another major clue in the murder was that there was eyewitnesses who saw a man near the Wennells' house the night before and the night of the murder. From their description, the police were able to compose this composite sketch. A few months after the murder, Kay's family was looking through some old photos and they came across a picture of this man. Kay's family has no idea who he is and they don't know how Kay knew him. One thing that they did know was that he looked a lot like the man in the composite sketch. Police are hoping that the man in the picture will come forward or someone who knows him will contact them. Without him, the murder of Eva Kay Wennell may never be solved. Number 1. William Richard Bradford's picture collection. In July 1984, the body of a woman was found in an alley in Los Angeles. She had been strangled to death. Her shirt was missing and some of her skin had been cut off. She had no identification, so she was called Jane Doe number 60. A month later, 15-year-old Tracy Campbell went missing. She was last seen with her neighbor, William Richard Bradford, who was awaiting trial for rape. His apartment was searched, and inside they found 56 pictures of nearly 60 women. 2 of the pictures were of Campbell and of Jane Doe number 60. Using a rock formation in the picture, the police were able to find where Bradford had taken Campbell. It was a campsite in the desert north of Los Angeles. At the campsite, they found Campbell's body. She had been strangled to death and her face was wrapped up in Jane Doe number 60's shirt. Jane Doe number 60 was later identified as 21-year-old Sherry Miller, who Bradford met at a bar. He lured her out to the desert by saying he was a photographer and he wanted to help her build her modeling portfolio. After raping and strangling her, Bradford cut off her tattoos and dumped the body. Then, a month later, he used the same tactic to lure Campbell to her death. Bradford was convicted of both murders and he was sentenced to death. Then, in 2006, the Los Angeles Police Department released the 54 pictures of the women that were found in Bradford's apartment. One of the pictures, number 28, was identified as Donna Lee Campbell Dumas. Her headless corpse was found in Malibu in 1978. 5 days before her body was found, Dumas had met Bradford at a bar. Just like with Miller and Campbell, the police believe that Bradford promised to take her pictures for a modeling job. The LAPD suspects that Bradford was actually a prolific serial killer who used the modeling tactic to get his victims into remote areas. They believe that he has more victims and they are trying to identify all the women in the pictures. A few of them have been identified. For example, woman number 3 is the sister of CSI Miami actress Eva LaRue. However, many of the women have yet to be identified. As for Bradford, he took the true number of his victims to his grave. He died of cancer at the age of 61 in March 2008. Number 3. Roger Reed Jr. and LaShonda Williams. On Halloween Day 2014, 23-year-old Roger Reed Jr. and 24-year-old LaShonda Williams of Greenville, Mississippi, were in Memphis, Tennessee. That evening, they decided to go back to Greenville. They withdrew over $700 from an ATM in a convenience store, and despite having money, Reed decided to carjack someone. As they were walking down the road away from the store, 57-year-old Don Smith, who was a pastor at a local Baptist church, drove past them 3 or 4 times. He then pulled up beside the couple, and they asked him what he wanted. Smith said that he wanted to have sex with both of them, and he would pay them $40. The couple agreed, and they got into his car. At some point, Reed pulled out a gun and shot the pastor in the head. They loaded his body into the back seat and drove to a wooded area where they dumped the body near a pond. After they dumped the body, they used the car to pick up Williams' 2 daughters and they drove back to Greenville. Not long after Smith's body was dumped, it was found by 2 people walking their dog. This sparked a search for his car, and it was found 4 days later at a convenience store in Greenville. Reed and Williams were in the car. They took off and the police pursued. After a high-speed car chase, the couple finally gave up. In Williams' purse, they found the murder weapon. It turned out that besides the car, they also stole $40 and Smith's watch. They also found some innocent-looking pictures on Williams' Facebook and her phone. In the photos, Reed and Williams are smiling and look happy. In one of the pictures, they are even kissing. All of the photos were taken shortly after the murder, and they were taken inside the pastor's car. Reed denied committing the murder. He said that on Halloween night, Williams got into a strange car after they got into an argument. She returned a short time later driving the car, and Smith's dead body was in the back seat. His lawyer pointed out that the gun was found in Williams' purse, the selfies were taken on her phone, and they were uploaded to her Facebook account. The jury didn't buy his story, and Reed was sentenced to life. Williams testified against Reed, and she was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Number 2. George Thompson, Ron Finley, and Daniel Johnson. On the morning of June 16, 2015, a visitor to the Baptist Church Cemetery in Carlisle, Cumbria, England, made a horrifying discovery. It was the dead body of a teenage boy. The police were called and the body was sent to the medical examiner. He was identified as 14-year-old Jordan Watson. He had been struck 40 to 50 times, and he died from 9 deep gashes caused by a large knife. The police started their investigation by looking at the people that Jordan last had contact with. This led to them phoning 18-year-old George Thompson, a supposed friend of Jordan, and they asked him to come to the police station to talk about Jordan's murder. When he got the call, Thompson was at McDonald's with a friend, and he told the friend that he wasn't involved in the stabbing. However, at this point, the cause of death had not been revealed publicly. This was only the first mistake of many that Thompson made. The police looked in his bedroom, and they found more than 70 weapons. One of them was a kukri knife, and it had blood on it. The DNA was tested, and the blood belonged to Jordan. The police checked Thompson's cell phone and found out that he had been planning the murder for some time. He even got 2 friends involved, Ron Finley, 19, and Daniel Johnson, who was also 19. They lured Jordan out to the cemetery by telling him that they were meeting a man to sell him some weapons. They told him he would get a cut of the money if he came. Jordan looked up to Thompson, so he went to the cemetery just after midnight. When Jordan got to the cemetery, Thompson beat him and then hacked him to death while Finley and Johnson cheered him on. Just an hour before killing Jordan, the 3 friends posed for this selfie. It was taken in Thompson's bedroom, and the trio knew that they were on their way to kill Jordan. As for why they would kill the 14-year-old, it was because Thompson was jealous. Thompson had fallen in love with Jordan's 14-year-old girlfriend, and he wanted Jordan out of the way. In early 2016, all 3 young men were convicted of killing Jordan Watson. Daniel Johnson was sentenced to 10 years, Ron Finley was given a minimum term of 14 years, and the ringleader, George Thompson, was sentenced to a minimum of 27 years. Number 1. Franklin Floyd. Franklin Delano Floyd was born in June 1943. He grew up in an orphanage in Georgia after his father died and his mother ran off. His life of crime started when he was 17 years old. After a robbery, he exchanged gunfire with the police. He was shot in the stomach, but he survived. He spent about a year and a half in a youth institute, and he was freed in August 1961. In June 1962, at the age of 19, he kidnapped a 4-year-old girl from a bowling alley in Hapville, Georgia. Floyd was found with the girl in the forest a short time afterwards. He was arrested and the girl was returned to her parents. A month later, he was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison for child molestation. He escaped in February 1963, and he was arrested again after he robbed a bank in Macon, Georgia. Floyd was given a 15-year sentence for the robbery, but it ran concurrent with his other sentences. This allowed him to be paroled in 1973, after serving just 10 years in prison. Not long after being released on parole, Floyd grabbed a woman who was walking along a street and he tried to force her into his van. Luckily, she escaped and Floyd was arrested, but for some reason he was allowed to remain free while awaiting trial. Floyd didn't show up for his trial though. Instead, he moved away from Georgia and the authorities lost track of him. He ended up in North Carolina and he married a woman named Sandy Chipman who had 4 children, 3 daughters, and an infant son. In 1975, Chipman was jailed in Dallas, Texas for 30 days on a minor charge. She left her children in the care of Floyd. When she got out of prison, she discovered that Floyd had disappeared with the children. She contacted the police, and they said that since Floyd was the stepfather, he had a right to take the children. Chipman found out that 2 of her children had been dropped off at a church, but her 6-year-old daughter, Suzanne Savekis, and her infant son were still missing. Since the police told Chipman that Floyd had a right to take the kids, they were never reported missing. Floyd and Suzanne, but not the infant boy, resurfaced again a few months later in Oklahoma City. He said that his name was Trenton B. Davis and that Suzanne was his daughter. He enrolled her in school, and not long afterwards he had this picture taken where they are posing as a father and daughter. 9 years later, they moved to Georgia, and Floyd started using the name Warren Marshall, and Suzanne started using the name Sharon Marshall. Suzanne graduated from high school with honors, and she became pregnant shortly afterwards. They moved to Valrico, Florida, and on April 21, 1988, she gave birth to a son named Michael. Next, they moved to Pinellas Park, Florida, and Suzanne worked as an exotic dancer in nearby Tampa. Her co-workers thought it was strange that Suzanne's father would come in and watch her strip. While working there, Suzanne befriended a co-worker, 19-year-old Cheryl Comesso. In the spring of 1989, Floyd convinced Comesso that he could get her work in Hollywood if he could take some nude photos of her. Comesso agreed, but soon after learned that Floyd had scammed her. To get revenge, Comesso called the welfare office and told them that Suzanne was receiving welfare checks while she was working at the club. Floyd took all of Suzanne's money, and when he found out what Comesso did, he became enraged and confronted her outside the club. Floyd hit her at least once and had to be physically restrained from continuing his attack. About 2 weeks after the confrontation, in the first week of April, Comesso went missing. In May 1989, Floyd, Suzanne, and Michael went to New Orleans. Using the names Clarence Marcus Hughes and Tanya Dawn Tadlock, Floyd and Suzanne got married. Then they moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Suzanne continued to work as an exotic dancer. On April 24, 1990, Floyd, Suzanne, and Michael drove to Oklahoma to stay in a motel because Suzanne had an early morning doctor's appointment there. At 12:55 a.m. on April 25th, a call came into 911 that a woman had been struck in a hit-and-run accident and she was lying on the side of the road near the motel. The paramedics took her to the hospital, and the only thing that she could say was "Daddy." The next morning, Floyd drove to a store near the motel looking for Suzanne, and a person at the store said that a woman had been taken to the hospital hours earlier after she was struck by a car. Floyd went to the hospital and said that the woman was his wife, and he gave them her alias, Tanya Dawn Hughes. Suzanne died 5 days later. Floyd gave Michael to the foster care system, and then he left town. This prompted the police to start looking into Tanya Dawn Hughes' history. When they did, they found out her husband's real name was Franklin Floyd, and he was wanted for the attempted kidnapping in 1973. Floyd was found living in Augusta, Georgia 2 weeks after he fled. He was arrested for the 1973 attempted kidnapping, and he was incarcerated. While he was in prison, he fought for the parental rights of Michael. Michael had been placed with a family, and they wanted to adopt him, but couldn't because of Floyd. A paternity test was ordered, and it concluded that Floyd was not the father of Michael. Michael's father was a high school classmate of Suzanne's. Floyd spent 33 months in prison, and he was released on March 30th, 1993. 15 months later, on September 12, 1994, Floyd went to Michael's school in Choctaw, Oklahoma, armed with a gun. He forced the principal to get 6-year-old Michael out of class. Floyd then got Michael and the principal into the principal's pickup truck. At gunpoint, he forced the principal to drive to a forested area. Once there, he got the principal out of the truck and handcuffed him to a tree. Floyd then drove off in the truck with Michael. The principal was found 4 hours later, and the police were alerted. 2 months later, Floyd was found in Kentucky. He was arrested at the car sales lot where he worked. Michael wasn't with him, and he has never been found. Floyd originally told the police that he left Michael with someone he knows, and that he is alive and safe. While investigating Floyd, they found this picture and did some math. They knew that Floyd was in prison at the time that Suzanne would have been conceived, so they knew that it wasn't his daughter. So they asked him what her real identity was and where did he get her from. Floyd said that he saved her from her mother, who was a drug addict, and he couldn't remember her name. The police tried to find out who she might be, but because no missing persons report was ever filed, they had no idea who she was and where she came from. 5 months later, the body of Cheryl Camesso was found in Florida, not far from where she was last seen. Her body, which had been dumped beside an interstate, had been there for 5 or 6 years. She had been badly beaten and shot in the head. Just 2 days before the skeletal remains were found, the principal's pickup truck that Floyd stole was being broken down for parts after it was sold in an auction. Taped to the undercarriage of the truck was a manila envelope. In the envelope, there were 97 pictures of 4 young girls being sexually abused. Most of the pictures were of Suzanne throughout the years. Camesso was another girl who appeared in the pictures. It showed her tied up and beaten. Floyd was convicted of killing Cheryl Camesso on September 28, 2002, and he was sentenced to death. However, the conviction brought very little closure to the case. Notably, what was the real identity of the woman he called his daughter and then married, and what happened to Michael? So the FBI continued to interview him throughout the years, and in 2014 they found out Suzanne's true identity. They contacted her mother, and through DNA they confirmed that she was her missing daughter. Sadly, the whereabouts of her infant son are still unknown, but it is presumed that he is dead. The location of Michael is also unknown, but in 2016 Floyd admitted to shooting him to death on the day that he kidnapped him. He said that he buried him somewhere near the Oklahoma and Texas border. The police searched the area, but they did not turn up his remains. Currently, Franklin Floyd is sitting on death row in Florida. He has never been charged with the murder of Suzanne, but he is considered the only suspect. Number 3. Daniela Poggiali. In 2014, 42-year-old Daniela Poggiali was working as a nurse at a hospital in Lugo, Italy. The families of patients never had any complaints about her, but her co-workers did. They thought she was cold and vindictive. She would do things like give her patients laxatives at the end of her shift so that whoever was taking over would have a more difficult shift. Her co-workers said that if she became irritated with a patient, she would give them a sedative so they would pass out. She even joked with other nurses that she killed annoying patients by giving them a lethal dose of potassium chloride. Potassium chloride is one of 3 drugs that are injected into people who are being executed via lethal injection. It's the 3rd drug, and it stops the heart. In April 2014, 78-year-old Rosa Calderoni was admitted to the hospital with a non-life-threatening illness. Suddenly, Calderoni died. A local medical watch group requested that an autopsy be performed on her. The autopsy revealed that Calderoni had high levels of potassium in her body when she died. The police interviewed Calderoni's daughter, and she said that the last nurse to help her mother was Pojali. This led the police to start investigating Pojali. The first thing they did was look at Pojali's patient history. During the first 3 months of 2014, Pojali's unit had 83 patients. When Pojali was on duty, 38 of them died. The other nurses in the unit only had an average of 10 patients die in the same time period. Then the police looked at Pojali's smartphone and went through her WhatsApp account. When they did, they came across these photos. They were taken in January 2014 by a coworker. Pojali said that the patient wasn't dead when the picture was taken. The police interviewed the nurse who took the pictures, and she said that the man in the pictures was a patient of Pojali's, and he was most certainly dead when the photographs were taken. She said that on the day the photos were taken, Pojali was euphoric. She also said that she didn't go to the police earlier because she was afraid of Pojali. In October 2014, Pojali was arrested and she was charged with the murder of Calderoni. Even though she was only charged with one murder, she was suspected of causing up to 96 deaths. She was convicted of murdering Calderoni, and in March 2016, she was sentenced to life in prison. Then in the summer of 2017, Pojali appealed her conviction. Her lawyer said that while there were high levels of potassium in Calderoni's body, it couldn't be determined if that was the actual cause of death. He also pointed out that there is no evidence that she was involved in any other deaths. Finally, the lawyer said that the pictures were in bad taste, but they were not evidence of murder. On July 7th, Pojali's conviction was overturned and she was acquitted. After spending 3 years in prison since her arrest, she was released and she is now free. Either Daniela Pojali is a horrible serial killer that is responsible for dozens of cold-blooded murders and is still walking the streets, or she is an innocent woman who spent 3 years in prison because her co-workers didn't like her and because of 2 ill-conceived photos. Number 2. Anton Lundin Pettersson. Growing up in Trollhättan, Sweden, Anton Lundin Pettersson was a loner who spent a lot of time by himself. As an adult, he embraced some racist ideologies and he was strongly against immigration. He visited many right-wing websites and he enjoyed movies that portrayed Nazis in a positive or sympathetic light. In October 2015, he learned that he was not going to get a job that he wanted. He then went online and ordered a German military helmet and a sword called Cold Steel Viking. On October 22, 2015, Lundin Pettersson walked into Kronan School wearing the helmet, which looked a lot like Darth Vader's helmet, and armed with a sword. Lundin Pettersson lived across the road from a school, but he drove several miles to Kronan. Kronan is located in a neighborhood with a high population of immigrants. When he got into the school, he quoted one of Darth Vader's most famous lines, "I am your father." Many of the students thought that it was a Halloween prank. 2 students asked him if they could pose for a picture with him. He didn't say anything, but he posed with the students for this photograph. Lavina Skandar, a 20-year-old teacher's assistant, asked Lundin Pettersson who he was and to remove his helmet. When he went to take off the helmet, Eskandar yelled for the students to run, and he tried to wrestle the sword away. Sadly, it's a fight he didn't win. After stabbing the teacher's assistant, he started roaming around the school looking for other victims. While he wandered around the hallways, he was recorded on the school's CCTV system. He then came across 15-year-old Ahmed Hassan. He stabbed Ahmed, and then went looking for more people to stab. He found a class being taught by 42-year-old math teacher Nazir Amso. Amso told London Pedersen to leave the school, so London Pedersen stabbed him in front of his students. The students in the classroom fled, and London Pedersen continued to stalk the hallways of the school. He knocked on the door of a classroom, and 15-year-old Wahid Kasso answered the door. When he did, London Pedersen chopped him on his left side. About 15 minutes after the attack started, 2 police officers arrived at the school. When they found him in a hallway, he raised his sword and ran at them. They both fired a shot at him, and one was a hit. London Pedersen, along with 2 of his victims, Iskandar and Ahmed, died at the scene. Amso and Wahid were taken to the hospital. Wahid survived, but Amso died 6 weeks later. After the attack, the police went to London Pedersen's apartment and found a note that he had written. In the note, he wrote that this day would probably be his last. He also said that something needed to be done about immigration in Sweden. All of his victims had dark skin, and they had all immigrated to Sweden. The massacre is the deadliest school attack in Swedish history. Number 1. Robert Berdella. To most people who knew him, Robert Berdella was a quirky guy. As an adult, he lived in Kansas City, Missouri, and he owned a curiosity shop called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar. So while people considered him strange, they thought he was harmless. He was an active member of his community, and he helped start the Neighborhood Watch program in his area. Then something happened on Easter weekend in April 1988 that would change everyone's perception of him. On April 2nd, a neighbor of Berdella's was brought to the door because someone was frantically banging on it. When they answered the door, they found a man in his early 20s wearing nothing but a dog collar. He said that he was taken hostage by Berdella 5 days ago. The neighbor called the police and they arrested Berdella. When the detectives started going through Berdella's house, it became hard to tell what was evidence and what wasn't. Berdella collected odd things, like skulls and items linked to the occult. But then they started to uncover something much more sinister, and it wasn't long before Berdella's dark secret life came to light. At the time of his arrest, Berdella had been openly gay for over a decade, and he was known to hang out with male sex workers. One of those sex workers was 19-year-old Jerry Howell. On July 6, 1984, Berdella used Howell to indulge in his darkest fantasies for the first time. He drugged Howell with an animal tranquilizer, and then he raped and tortured him over the course of the day. While he tortured him, he took photographs with his Polaroid camera and detailed the torture in a log. Howell ended up dying from asphyxiation. Berdella drained the blood from his body in the bathtub, dismembered him, and then put him out with the trash. The trash collector took the body to the landfill, and it has never been recovered. The next year, in April, a friend of Berdella's, 18-year-old Robert Sheldon, asked Berdella if he could stay with him for a few days. Berdella agreed and Sheldon moved in on April 10th. Berdella drugged him on the first day that he moved in, but then he decided not to torture him. 2 days later, Berdella changed his mind, and again, he drugged Sheldon. Sheldon endured 4 days of torture, which was all documented by Berdella with his Polaroid camera and his written logs. On August 16th, a repairman was coming by to do work on Berdella's house, so Berdella put a plastic bag over Sheldon's head until he stopped breathing. He drained the blood from the body in the bathtub, and then he dismembered him. He put most of Sheldon's body out with the garbage. This time, he kept his victim's head and buried it in the backyard. On June 22, 1985, there was a storm in Kansas City. 22-year-old Mark Wallace was an acquaintance of Berdella, and he got stuck in the downpour while he was in Berdella's neighborhood. Looking for shelter, he ran to a shed that was in Berdella's backyard. Berdella saw him in the shed and invited him inside the house. Wallace may have been one of the more fortunate victims of Berdella. He asphyxiated to death after only a few hours. Several months later, on September 26, 1985, Berdella picked up 20-year-old James Ferris at a bar and invited him back to his house. Ferris asphyxiated to death the next day. Less than a year later, on June 17, 1986, Berdella crossed paths with 21-year-old Todd Stoops. Stoops was a sex worker, and Berdella had known him for years. Berdella kept him alive for over 3 weeks. Stoops finally died on July 6 from blood loss, and Berdella put his remains out with the trash, just like he did with his other victims. 11 months would go by before Berdella found another victim. 20-year-old Larry Pearson called Berdella from jail because he needed someone to bail him out. Berdella paid Pearson's bail, and he invited him to come stay with him for a few days. Berdella ended up torturing him for over a month. Like he did with his other victims, Berdella wrote logs about the torture, and he took many Polaroid pictures. On August 5th, 6 weeks after Berdella started torturing Pearson, Pearson bit Berdella's genitals. Berdella went to the hospital, and they told him that he needed to be hospitalized for a few days. He agreed, but he said he had to go home first. When he got home, he put a plastic bag over Pearson's head and suffocated him. Berdella went back to the hospital, spent 2 days there, and then was released. Once he got home, he dismembered Pearson's body, and he put most of his remains out with the garbage, but buried his head in the backyard. He also dug up Sheldon's skull and moved it inside the house. On March 29, 1988, Berdella picked up Chris Bryson, a man he'd known for years. On April 2nd, while Berdella was at work, Bryson managed to burn the ropes that were used to bound him. He jumped out of a second-story window and ran to Berdella's neighbor's house. Berdella's house was searched by the police, and they found his logs, the Polaroid pictures, and the 2 skulls. The 2 skulls were the only remains ever found. Berdella pleaded guilty to all 6 murders, and he was sentenced to life in December 1988. He died nearly 4 years later in October 1992. Thanks a lot for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe. We post a new video every Thursday and Sunday, and thanks to everyone who already does subscribe. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We may even follow you back. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching. Number 3. Nancy Stewart Ranko Williams. Nancy Stewart Ranko Williams was born and raised in Powhatan Point, Ohio. When she was 16, she gave birth to a daughter named Jennifer. Jennifer was raised by Williams' parents because Williams lived an unstable lifestyle. She hitchhiked, she drank heavily, she was addicted to drugs, and she worked as a sex worker. In early 1988, Williams was living in Sandy Springs, Georgia. She made frequent trips to visit her family in Ohio. When she would visit, she would stay at a motel in Wheeling, which is just across the state line in West Virginia. Her family knew that she was meeting with Johns when she stayed in Wheeling. During this time, Williams wasn't living alone, nor was she alone when she traveled back to visit her family. She was always with a man who went by several different names. He told people his name was Robert or Bob Matthew, Tom Katz, Bob or Tom Wilson, and Tom or Robert Tate. Williams told several family members that she was afraid of her boyfriend. She also said she wanted to leave him, but she couldn't. Then in February 1988, Williams, who was 26 years old, stopped calling her family. Around the time they lost contact with her, Williams' boyfriend called her family. He said that Williams had left him and she was moving back to Ohio. But Williams' family never saw or heard from her again. They also never heard back from the mysterious boyfriend who went by multiple names. 30 years later, Williams' family still doesn't know what happened to her. They believe that she is most likely dead, and her boyfriend probably had something to do with it. In 2016, a television news program was doing a story about Williams' disappearance, and they uncovered a photograph of Williams' mysterious boyfriend. It is one of two photographs of the man that the police have. The other photograph has never been made public. The police have no idea who the man is. Because he used different aliases, the police believe that he had something to hide with regards to his true identity. The police are hoping that someone will recognize the man and get in contact with them. He may be the only person who knows what happened to Nancy Stewart Ranko Williams. Number 2. Annette K. Schnee and Barbara Jo Oberholzer. In early 1982, 29-year-old Barbara Jo Oberholzer lived with her husband, Jeff, in the small town of Alma, Colorado. Jeff ran an appliance repair shop, and Barbara worked in an office in the nearby town of Breckenridge. On January 6, 1982, Barbara had been promoted to office manager. After work, to celebrate her promotion, Barbara and some co-workers went to a bar that was located in the same strip mall as their office. Barbara called her husband Jeff and told him that she was going to stay for a few drinks. Jeff asked her if she wanted him to pick her up later, but she said no. She said she would just hitchhike home. At about 7:45 p.m., Barbara left the bar and she walked out into the cold January night. Her co-workers saw her standing in front of a nearby store hitchhiking. She was heading south towards Alma. At home, Jeff prepared dinner, but he fell asleep. Around midnight, he woke up and he was surprised that Barbara hadn't returned home. He figured that she was just having fun and chose to stay at the bar longer. But at around 2 a.m., after the bar was closed, she still hadn't returned home, and he became worried. Jeff called her co-workers, and they said she left the bar hours earlier. Jeff tried to report her missing, but the police told him it was too soon to file a missing persons report. The next day at about 3 p.m., the police were called by someone who had been cross-country skiing near Hoosiers Pass. Hoosiers Pass is a high mountain pass that connects Breckenridge and Alma. A woman's body had been found near the parking lot of the summit. The body was identified as 29-year-old Barbara Jo Oberholzer. Based on the evidence found at the crime scene, the police were able to figure out what happened. It is believed that the killer picked up Barbara and started driving her home. He then pulled into the parking lot of the summit and tried to bound her with plastic zip ties. They think this is what happened because her keys were found in the parking lot and there was a plastic zip tie on one of her wrists. But it's believed that Barbara fought with her attacker. The police think she probably punched him in the nose and this caused him to bleed. She then got out of the vehicle and started running downhill. She made it about 300 feet, and then she seemed to hesitate, and she backtracked near a set of trees. She was then shot twice. One bullet grazed her right breast, and the other one hit her in the chest. When she was shot, the shooter was about 2 or 3 feet away from her. Barbara either bled or froze to death. The gun wasn't recovered at the crime scene, but it was a .38 or .357 caliber handgun. The bullets were Peters copper jacketed hollow points. Near the body, the police found a backpack and a single orange sock. Neither of them belonged to Barbara. At first, it was a mystery as to who the items belonged to. But that mystery was solved about 6 months later when the body of 21-year-old Annette K. Schnee was found about 16 miles from Barbara's body. Annette was wearing the other orange sock. It was also determined that the backpack found near Barbara's body belonged to Annette. Annette went missing from Breckenridge just hours before Barbara was last seen hitchhiking out of town. At about 4:45 p.m. on the day she went missing, Annette picked up a prescription from a pharmacy in Breckenridge. She was seen talking to a woman outside of the pharmacy. The woman was described as slender and about 5 feet 5 inches tall. She looked a little rough, like she had been camping for a few days. The woman smoked Marlboro cigarettes. Annette was supposed to work at a bar that was attached to a hotel in Breckenridge at 8 p.m., but she never made it to her shift. She didn't even make it home to pick up her work uniform. It's thought that after she picked up her prescription, she started hitchhiking towards home, and the killer picked her up. He took her to a secluded area near Sacramento Creek, where he sexually assaulted her. After the assault, Annette probably dressed quickly, and she put on one orange sock and one sock that was striped. It's thought she also ran away from her attacker. She had been shot once in the back with a handgun that was a .38 caliber or a .357 caliber or 9mm. After shooting Annette, the killer drove back to Breckenridge and he picked up Barbara. When Barbara was trying to escape, she probably knocked the orange sock out of the killer's vehicle. Even before Annette's body was found, the police thought that the two victims were connected simply because they went missing hours apart from the same small town. They also had similar physical features. They had long blonde hair, they were both 5'3", and they both weighed around 100 pounds. The first suspect in the case was Barbara's husband, Jeff Oberholzer. After both women went missing, Jeff was asked if he knew Annette Schnee. At first, he said no. But then he saw a news story about her disappearance, and he called the police. He said that he recognized her because a few months before she went missing, he picked her up while she was hitchhiking. On the drive, Annette mentioned she had an appliance that needed to be fixed. Jeff, who owned an appliance repair shop, gave her his business card. Jeff said he never saw or heard from Annette again. The police looked in Annette's wallet and they found Jeff's business card. Jeff also turned in 2 pieces of evidence to the police. He said on the same day that Barbara's body was found, he was driving on US 285 several miles from where she was killed, and on the side of the road, he happened to find Barbara's right glove that was blood-stained and a tissue that was also stained with blood. The police thought that this was too much of a coincidence, and they had Jeff come in and do a polygraph exam. During the exam, he said he wasn't involved in either murder. He passed the polygraph exam, but he remained a suspect for years. Another suspect in the 2 murders is a man named Thomas Edward Luther. On February 13, 1982, just over a month after Barbara and Annette were killed, Luther picked up a 21-year-old woman at the bus depot in Breckenridge. The woman was supposed to get a ride to Silverthorne, Colorado with some friends, but her bus was late and she had missed her friends. Luther took the woman to an isolated area near Silverthorne. He sexually assaulted the woman and hit her in the head with a claw-tooth hammer. After he assaulted her, he let her go. She found help at a nearby house. She was taken to the hospital, and she described her attacker's vehicle. The woman survived the assault, and thanks to her description of the vehicle, Luther was arrested. In the summer of 1983, Luther pleaded guilty to sexual assault. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and then he was released in early 1993. On March 28, 1993, about 3 months after he was released from prison, Luther killed 20-year-old Cher Elder, who was the girlfriend of one of his friends. He shot her 3 times in the back of the head and buried her beside the interstate near Empire, Colorado. About 2 weeks after killing Elder, on April 12, 1993, Luther called 21-year-old Heather Smith, who lived in Denver. Smith had placed an ad in the newspaper trying to sell her car. Luther told her he wanted to come take a look at the car. Even though it was late in the evening, she agreed to show him the car. As she was showing him the car, he attacked her. When he did, Smith screamed, and her neighbor heard it. Luther stabbed Smith 5 times before he got into his car and drove off. Smith was rushed to the hospital, and she survived her attack. She gave a description of her attacker, but it didn't lead to an arrest. While Luther remained on the loose, he had become the prime suspect in the disappearance of Cher Elder. However, since the police couldn't find her body, they didn't have enough evidence to prove that Elder was dead, let alone that Luther killed her. Over a year later, in August 1994, Luther was in West Virginia. On August 21st, he picked up 32-year-old Bobby Joe Jones, who was hitchhiking near Delray. With Jones in the car, he stopped off at a remote cabin for a few minutes, and then they started driving again. He then found an isolated area and parked the car. He sexually assaulted and beat Jones, but ultimately, he let her go. Jones reported the assault, and she gave the police the location of the cabin where they stopped. The police watched the cabin, and a few days after the assault, Luther returned to the cabin, and he was arrested. In January 1995, he was convicted of sexual assault, and he was sentenced to 17 years in prison. A month later, Cher Elder's boyfriend told the police where to find her body. When her body was found, the Denver Post ran an article on it. The article featured a photograph of Tom Luther. Heather Smith recognized him as the man who attacked her. Smith told the police that Luther was her attacker, and he was charged with attempted murder. In the spring of 1996, Luther was found guilty of second-degree murder in the murder of Cher Elder. A month later, he was found guilty of attempted murder for the attack on Heather Smith. He received a sentence of 48 years for the second-degree murder conviction and 50 years for the attempted murder conviction. While Luther was in prison, he bragged about killing Barbara Oberholzer and Annette Schnee. Annette and Barbara were similar to Luther's other victims, who were all petite young women. The police interviewed Luther about the murders of Annette and Barbara, and he denied being involved. Luther took 2 polygraph exams, and he said he didn't kill the 2 women. He failed both times. A third suspect in the murders of Annette and Barbara is Tracy Petrocelli, who also went by the name John Maida. In the fall of 1981, Petrocelli and his 18-year-old girlfriend, Melanie Barker, broke up. Barker said she left Petrocelli because he was abusive and he was addicted to gambling. After the breakup, Barker moved from Reno, Nevada to Washington State. Petrocelli followed her there. Then one day in April 1982, Petrocelli kidnapped her as she was leaving work. He held her captive for 3 days, and during that time, he beat her. On the third day of her captivity, she was finally able to escape, and Petrocelli was arrested. A month later, he was given a suspended sentence for kidnapping, and he was sent to a drug rehabilitation center. Petrocelli ended up leaving the program without completing it. Then one night in October 1981, Petrocelli showed up at the bar where Barker was working just outside of Seattle. He dragged her outside and shot her 3 times while the patrons of the bar watched on in horror. Petrocelli then went on the run. During his time on the run, it is suspected that Petrocelli traveled around the country and made friends with other criminals. He would team up with these men to commit robberies, which often ended with them killing the robbery victim. Then after the robberies, Petrocelli would kill his accomplice. Around the time that Annette and Barbara were killed, Petrocelli was in Colorado. He and an accomplice, who has never been identified, went to a car lot in Thorne, Colorado, which is about 85 miles from Breckenridge. Petrocelli and his partner asked the salesman if they could take a car for a test drive. The salesman got into the car with Petrocelli and his accomplice. At some point during the test drive, Petrocelli's accomplice shot the salesman in the head. The salesman ultimately survived the shooting. Petrocelli then moved on to Nevada. On March 29, 1982, about 3 months after Barbara and Annette were killed, Petrocelli visited a car lot in Reno, Nevada. He got 63-year-old salesman John Wilson to go on a test drive with him. During the drive, Petrocelli shot and killed Wilson. About a month after Wilson's murder, the police received an anonymous tip that Petrocelli was renting a room in a house in Las Vegas, Nevada. He was arrested shortly after the police received the tip. In his possession was the gun he used to kill both Wilson and Barker. Petrocelli was found guilty of killing Wilson, and he was sentenced to death. But in 2017, his death sentence was overturned, and he is currently sitting in a Nevada prison. Petrocelli was asked about his time in Colorado, and he said that he only spent one night in the state. He said he spent a night in Breckenridge. The hotel he stayed at was attached to the bar where Annette Schnee worked. The police have DNA samples from the man who killed Annette and Barbara, and the police compared the DNA to all 3 suspects. First, they compared the DNA of Barbara's husband, Jeff. It was not a match. Jeff was also able to supply alibi witnesses who saw him or spoke to him on the night of the murders. Based on the witnesses' accounts, Jeff wouldn't have had enough time to kidnap and kill both women, so he was officially eliminated as a suspect. Next, the killer's DNA was compared to the DNA of Thomas Edward Luther, who attacked a woman in Breckenridge a month after the 2 murders. He also supposedly bragged about killing Annette and Barbara while he was in prison. His DNA was not a match either. Finally, Tracy Petrocelli's DNA was compared to the killer's DNA. Just like the other 2 suspects, his DNA did not match. But at the time of the murders, Petrocelli was working with an accomplice who has never been identified. It is possible that Petrocelli and his accomplice killed Barbara and Annette together, and the DNA belongs to his accomplice. But since the accomplice has never been identified, this is only speculation on the police's part. Luther and Petrocelli have not officially been eliminated as suspects. One final possible clue is a photograph that was found in Annette's backpack. Annette's backpack was found near Barbara's body. It is a photograph of a man who has never been identified. Annette's family and friends have never seen the man, and they do not know why she had a photograph of him. The police think it's possible that Annette found the photograph in the killer's vehicle and she put it in her backpack as a way to identify him later. But this is just speculation on the police's part. The police hope someone will recognize the man because they would like to talk to him and see if he knows anything about the murders of the two women. Since the police have the killer's DNA, it could just be a matter of time before the culprit is caught through reverse genealogy. This is the process which helped catch the Golden State Killer, who is also known as the original Night Stalker. Investigators can input the killer's DNA into public genealogy databases, and they should be able to find relatives of the killer. If they do find relatives, it will give them a small pool of possible suspects to investigate. So hopefully the next time we do a video on updates on cases previously featured on Criminally Listed, we'll be able to tell you that there was an arrest in the murders of Barbara Jo Oberholzer and Annette K. Schnee. Number 1. Alexander Mengel. In September 1982, Gary Simulowski followed in the footsteps of his two older brothers and joined the Westchester County Police Department. Not long after he joined the force, he worked undercover on school campuses around the county, trying to stem the flow of drugs. He was successful in his undercover job. In September 1984, he was named Police Officer of the Year for the county. However, due to budget cuts, Simulowski was moved from undercover work to patrol work. On the evening of February 24, 1985, Simulowski was patrolling the Sawmill River Parkway near Yonkers, New York. He noticed a Mercury Capri speeding, and the driver changed lanes twice without signaling. After Simulowski followed the car for a few minutes, he had the driver pull over. Simulowski radioed into his headquarters and gave them the license plate of the car that he pulled over. He walked up to the car and he found 4 people inside of it. 2 men were in the front seats, and a man and a woman were in the back seat. Simulowski had the driver step out of the car. The driver said his name was Alexander Mengel. He was a 30-year-old legal immigrant from Guyana. He came to the United States in November 1976, about 8 years earlier. His family had moved from West Germany to Guyana sometime after World War II. It's not clear if Mengel was born in West Germany or Guyana. For the past 8 years, he had been living in the Bronx. He told Simulowski he had a New York driver's license. Mengel explained that he and his friends had spent the weekend hunting in the Catskills Mountains. He opened the trunk and he showed Simulowski the guns that were inside. Simulowski asked to see Mengel's driver's license, and Mengel said he would have to find it. Simulowski went back to his car and he radioed in to his headquarters. He asked for backup because he wanted to search the car, but he was concerned because the occupants had guns. He asked the dispatcher to check the database to see if Alexander Mengel had a New York driver's license. The dispatcher told him that no one with that name had a New York driver's license. As Simulowski sat in his police car, Mengel walked up to the car and shot him point blank in the head. Mengel's friends then drove away in his car. The car Mengel was driving didn't really belong to him. It was registered under Mengel's estranged wife's name. His estranged wife and their son had gone into hiding because Mengel had been horribly abusive for years. A year earlier, he had broke her jaw and he was arrested. After Mengel's friends took off in his car, Mengel got into Simulowski's police car and drove it to a nearby neighborhood. He parked the car and then ran away. When Simulowski's fellow officers found him, he was dying in the passenger seat of his patrol car. He was rushed to the hospital. The doctors worked on him for 90 minutes in the hospital, but it was too late, and 27-year-old Gary Stimulowski was pronounced dead. By the next morning, Alexander Mengel was the most wanted man in New York State. Within 48 hours of the shooting, the police had found Mengel's car and his friends who were in the car, but they weren't cooperating with the police. They only started talking after they were threatened with long prison sentences. They said that Stimulowski's murder was senseless and unprovoked. They thought Mengel killed him simply because he didn't have a driver's license and he thought the car would be towed. They swore they didn't know where he went after the shooting. Around the same time that Mengel's friends were talking to the police got an anonymous tip from a young man in Buffalo, New York, that Mengel was in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. The police tracked down the caller, and it was a young man who was a friend of Mengel's sister. The young man, who was a college student, said he was walking across his campus when he encountered Mengel. He told the police that Mengel looked considerably different than the last time he saw him. He was clean shaven, his hair was really short, and he was wearing red lipstick. He was driving a white Toyota car that looked new, but it was covered in mud. The police in Toronto and its surrounding cities were alerted to keep an eye out for Mengel, who may have been driving a white Toyota. On March 2nd, 6 days after Stimulowski was killed, a police officer in Scarborough, Ontario, which was a city that bordered Toronto, saw a white Toyota Tercel with New York license plates. He recognized the man behind the wheel from a photograph that he saw earlier. It was Alexander Mengel. When Mengel saw the police car, he sped off. After a short drive, Mengel abandoned his vehicle and ran. The officer chased after him. Mengel found himself cornered, and he tried to pull a gun from the waistband of his pants. But he fumbled the gun and dropped it. He was arrested without anyone getting hurt or killed. The gun that Mengel dropped was Stimulowski's service weapon. The police checked the ownership of the white Toyota, and it belonged to 44-year-old Barbara Capone. Capone worked at an IBM satellite office in Ferry Dobbs, New York, not far from where Mengel ditched the patrol car. She had not been seen since leaving her office on February 25th, about 24 hours after Stimulowski was killed. The police searched Capone's car, and they were horrified by what they found. They found a woman's scalp with hair. The police suspected that it belonged to Capone. The police also found Capone's driver's license, and the picture had been changed. In the photograph, Mengel was wearing Capone's hair as a wig. The police believe he wore the hair as a disguise when he crossed the border into Canada. The police asked Mengel what he did with Capone's body. Mengel admitted to stealing the car, but he said he never encountered the owner. In a wooded area in the Catskills, about 100 miles from where Capone went missing, the police found a summer cabin that had been broken into and ransacked. Inside the cabin, they found some of Capone's blood and her fingerprints. The police brought search dogs to the cabin, and they began to search the woods for Capone's remains. After a few hours of searching, they found her body, which was wrapped in a shower curtain that was taken from the cabin in the woods. The cause of death was 2 stab wounds to the chest. It was clear from the state of the remains that Mengel tried to make a mask to go along with his grotesque wig. A few weeks after he was arrested, on March 27th, the police in Canada handed Mengel over to detectives with the Westchester Police Department. A month later, on April 26, he was being transported to Catskills Village for an arraignment on the murder of Beverly Capone. At the arraignment, he pleaded not guilty. He was then put into the back of a police car with his hands cuffed in front of him. As he was being driven back to Westchester County, he attacked the officer who was in the seat next to him. First he headbutted the officer, and then he started biting him. During the attack, Mangle tried to pull the gun out of the officer's holster. The officer's partner, who was driving, pulled the car over. He then shot Mangle in the head. Mangle was pronounced dead at the scene. The officer who was attacked was taken to the hospital, and he had to get stitches. The police don't think that Alexander Mangle's sudden murder spree was the only murders he committed. In fact, they think he was a serial killer. One potential victim was 13-year-old Antonella Mattina. Antonella lived in Flushing, which is a neighborhood in Queens, New York. She went missing on July 16, 1984, after she walked out of a bank. This was less than a year before Mangle went on his murderous spree. Antonella's body was found 3 years after she went missing in Westchester County. Her body was too badly decomposed to determine the cause of death. Mangle is considered a suspect in Antonella's murder for several reasons. Mangle's brother lived in the area where Antonella went missing. Mangle's estranged wife said she remembered that Mangle visited his brother on the day that Antonella went missing. Also, Antonella's body was found in an area that Mangle was known to go hunting. Finally, according to the book, Unearthing a Serial Killer by David Paul and Kevin F. McMurray, after Mangle was arrested, a man called the police in Yonkers. He told them they had called the police in Queens after Antonella went missing, and he described a man that he saw her with as she was walking away from the bank. He said that after Mangle made the news, he saw a picture of him and recognized him as the man he saw with Antonella shortly before she went missing. There were several odd things in Mangle's car that bolstered the police belief that he was a serial killer. The first was a tourist map of Pennsylvania. An area around Harrisburg was circled. In the circle were 2 X's. The X's were in forested areas and fields. Friends of Mangle said they spent time hunting in the Harrisburg area in 1982. Some people believe that the X's mark where Mangle either killed or buried his victims. The police also found 5 mysterious photographs in Mangle's car. One was a Polaroid, and the other 4 were wallet-sized prints. The photographs were of 5 teenage girls. They all look like they are class pictures that would have appeared in a yearbook. The police in Pennsylvania looked at their records, and the photographs didn't match any missing persons reports or any Jane Does. To this day, the police don't know who the girls in the photographs are. They think it's possible that they could be other victims of Mangle. The police are hoping that people will recognize the girls, and hopefully, they'll be able to confirm that Mangle just had their photographs and he didn't kill any of them. But they aren't wholly optimistic about that. Unfortunately, we may never know how many people Alexander Mangle killed. Number 3. Ronaldo Dogsaw. As 2010 was coming to an end, Ronaldo Dogsaw was 35 years old. He lived in Caloocan, which is a suburb of Manila, Philippines. Dogsaw worked as a councilman. He was also a member of the Brungrieve Peacekeeping Action Team. The team's objective was to reduce crime in the area. The team had a reputation for being aggressive. On New Year's Eve 2010, Dogsaw went to bed early and he asked his family to wake him up just before midnight. His family did as they were instructed, and then they stepped outside of their home to join in on the festivities. Dogsaw had his wife, daughter, and mother-in-law pose for a photo beside the family's car. As fireworks were going off around them, Dogsaw snapped several photographs of his family. Then suddenly, he fell to the ground. His confused family checked on him, and they discovered that he had been shot in the chest. They did not hear the gunshot because of the fireworks. Dogsaw's family reviewed the photos he took, and they saw something shocking in one of them. On the left-hand side of the photo, there is a man with a backward baseball hat pointing a gun at Dogsaw. Dogsaw had inadvertently photographed his killer. The police identified the man as 26-year-old Arnel Buenaflor. Buenaflor was a member of a gang called the Passaway Gang. It turned out that another gang member was also photographed. Michael Roland is seen on the right side of the photo. He worked as a lookout for the murder. A third gang member also participated in the murder. His name is Frederick Sales, and he is not in the photograph because he was standing behind Dogsaw. Sales also fired a shot at Dogsaw, but he missed. Buenaflor was arrested 6 days after the murder. His two accomplices were arrested later that same day. At the time of the shooting, Buenaflor was out on bail for robbery charges. He had been arrested for those charges on the orders of Ronaldo Dogsaw. Buenaflor claimed that Dogsaw was killed because he was tough on crime and he was violent when it came to dealing with suspected criminals. Buenaflor claimed that Dogsaw nearly killed him during the arrest. He said that Dogsaw and his team beat him up, and then Dogsaw shot him in the head. Buenaflor survived the shooting, but he was left with a scar. Buenaflor also claimed that he had not planned on killing Dogsaw that night. He said that he and his two accomplices happened upon Dogsaw and they saw their opportunity to kill him. The chief of police did not believe that Buenaflor and his gang acted on their own accord. He speculated that a powerful crime boss ordered the Passaway Gang to kill Dogsaw because of his work trying to reduce crime. But the crime lord was never identified and he was not charged in connection with Dogsaw's murder. Buenaflor and his accomplices were charged with murder. However, no record could be found as to what happened to them after they were charged. Number 2. Travis Alexander. Travis Alexander was born in Riverside, California on July 28, 1977. He was the third of 8 children. Both of his parents were addicted to crystal meth. His father was mostly absent. When his father was around, his parents would get into verbal and physical altercations. Alexander's mother would also physically and mentally abuse her 8 children. When Alexander was 8 years old, he started living with his grandparents. Soon after, his grandparents took in the rest of his siblings. His grandmother was a Mormon, and she taught the children about the Church of Latter-day Saints. Alexander became fascinated with Mormonism. When he was 10 years old, he was baptized. By the time he was 16, he was fully active in the church. After graduating from high school, Alexander was a missionary for 2 years in Denver, Colorado. In September 2001, when Travis Alexander was 24 years old, he started working for Prepaid Legal, which sold legal insurance policies. Legal insurance is when a person or a business pays a monthly fee and then they have access to a network of lawyers. In 2004, Alexander relocated to Mesa, Arizona, which has a large Mormon population. He made a lot of friends and he was active in the Mormon community. He continued to work for Prepaid Legal and he was successful. Out of 5,000 salespeople, he had the second best sales record. He also had his own team of associates. Alexander bought a BMW Series 3 and in July 2004, he purchased a 5-bedroom house in Mesa. The executives at Prepaid Legal were impressed with Alexander. They hired him to go around the country and give motivational speeches at seminars. Travis Alexander liked to date women. In the Church of Latter-day Saints, members are supposed to stay celibate until marriage. However, Alexander had sex with at least 2 women. In 2004, in late 2007 or early 2008, he was banned from the temple because of something he did with women. But both times his status was later reinstated. In September 2006, Travis Alexander was in Las Vegas, Nevada for a Prepaid Legal seminar. At the MGM Grand, a woman caught his eye. He introduced himself to her. She then introduced herself. Her name was Jodi Arias. Jodi Arias was born in July 1980 in Salinas, California. Arias has 3 full siblings and 1 half-sibling. As a child, she took piano lessons and played the flute. When she was 10, she got a camera and she fell in love with photography. Arias' parents noticed that something was off with their daughter. When she was young, she was defiant and she would run away from home. As a teenager, she was prone to violent mood swings. Arias' parents would physically reprimand her and her siblings. Arias considered it to be abuse and she didn't trust her parents. Arias had a habit of becoming obsessed with the young men she dated. Their hobbies and interests would suddenly become her hobbies and interests. When Arias was 17 years old, she moved out of her family home and moved in with the young man she was dating at the time. She ended up dropping out of school and she worked full-time as a waitress at Denny's. She lived with that boyfriend for about a year. Afterwards, she moved to Oregon and lived with another man. She found out that he was cheating on her, so she left him and moved to Big Sur, California. In March 2006, Arias signed up to be a Prepaid Legal associate. At the time, she was working as a waitress and a bartender. She lived in a house that she owned with her boyfriend, who was 20 years her senior, in Salinas, California. After meeting with a representative from Prepaid Legal, Arias didn't really think that Prepaid Legal was for her. So she continued to work as a waitress and bartender. Months later, the representative contacted her and convinced her to go to a seminar in Las Vegas, Nevada. That's where 26-year-old Jodi Arias met 29-year-old Travis Alexander. Alexander invited Arias to a black tie event for the upper echelon of Prepaid Legal the next night, and she accepted his invitation. This was their first date, and both were smitten with each other. They continued to see each other while they were in Las Vegas. When Arias returned to Salinas, she broke up with her live-in boyfriend of nearly 4 years. Alexander and Arias started a long-distance relationship. They talked to each other almost daily. They talked on the phone, sent text messages back and forth, emailed each other, and posted on each other's MySpace pages. Arias ended up converting to the Church of Latter-day Saints. In November 2006, just 2 months after meeting Alexander, she was baptized. Arias invited her family to the baptism, but none of them attended. Arias claimed that she and Alexander did sexual things early in the relationship, but they did not have intercourse. Throughout the rest of 2006, they continued to communicate and they would visit each other. At the end of 2006, Arias and her now ex-boyfriend lost their house to foreclosure, but she continued to live in Salinas. Arias and Alexander's relationship became official on February 2, 2007. After they officially started dating, Arias and Alexander went on weekend road trips together. They visited tourist attractions, museums, and places mentioned in the Book of Mormon. Many of Alexander's friends didn't realize he was dating anyone. The friends who had met Arias thought she was strange and seemed obsessed with Alexander. They also thought she was very possessive. Some of them even thought she was dangerous. Arias would often read Alexander's emails, social media messages, and text messages without his knowledge. In June 2007, she found some text messages that indicated he was cheating. They ended up breaking up at the end of June. Although they broke up, not much changed in their relationship. They continued to frequently communicate. 2 weeks after they broke up, Arias moved to Mesa. Arias later said that Alexander encouraged her to move there. Alexander's friend said the opposite and said that he discouraged her from moving near him. Alexander had started dating another woman just days after he and Arias broke up. Nevertheless, Arias rented a home less than 4 miles from Alexander's house. After moving there, and even though Alexander was dating another woman, Arias would sneak into his house a few nights a week and they would have sex. In September 2007, the woman Alexander was dating found out that he was still seeing Arias, so she broke up with him. However, a short time later, he was able to convince her to get back together. After that, Alexander noticed some odd things happening around his home. For example, he would come home and find that items had been moved or were missing. One time he came home and he found Arias inside the home. She said she got in through a doggy door. In December 2007, all 4 tires of Alexander's car were slashed. He had the tires replaced the next day. That night, his tires were slashed again. A few weeks later, Alexander's girlfriend's tires were slashed. In early 2008, Travis Alexander was having a difficult time with his finances. The economy had taken a turn for the worse, and people weren't spending money as freely as they did before. He ended up selling his BMW to Arias. He also broke up with the woman he was dating. He claimed that he broke up with her so he could get back on track financially. A few weeks later, he started dating another woman he met at church. After he started dating the new woman, Alexander again noticed odd things happening around his home. For example, someone had ripped out pages from a book he had just purchased. At the end of April 2008, Arias moved from Mesa, Arizona to Yreka, California. Even though they weren't in a relationship or living in the same city, Alexander and Arias continued to communicate via the phone, email, social media, and text messages. After moving to Yreka, Arias started dating another man. Like Alexander, he was a prepaid legal associate and a Mormon. He lived in Salt Lake City, Utah. At the beginning of May 2008, Alexander invited the woman he was dating to come to Cancun, Mexico with him. The trip was being paid for by Prepaid Legal. The woman accepted the invitation. But a few weeks before they were to go on the trip, the woman ended the relationship with Alexander. She thought that they were better off as friends. However, she was still going to go to Cancun because the tickets had been purchased in her name. Originally, Jodi Arias was supposed to go with Alexander on the trip. On May 26, 2008, Alexander and Arias got into a big fight. Alexander told his friends it was because Arias had logged on to his Facebook account. Arias claimed that Alexander got mad because he saw she had commented on another man's photo. Alexander told Arias he wanted her permanently out of his life. During this time, Arias was living with her grandparents. On May 28, 2008, her grandfather came home and discovered that a door had been kicked in. He looked around the home and only two things had been stolen: a DVD player and a .25 caliber handgun. The police thought that the break-in was odd. There were other guns in the home and they were untouched. Also, there was money in the house sitting in plain sight and it had not been stolen. On June 2, 2008, Jodi Arias rented a car. She told the person she was renting the car from that she was just going to drive it around town. On June 3rd, she stopped off at her ex-boyfriend's home and borrowed 2 gas cans. Later that day, she purchased another gas can at Walmart. She then purchased a large quantity of gas and turned off her cell phone. Arias had planned on visiting her boyfriend in Salt Lake City, which is over 750 miles from Wairika. She was supposed to arrive in Salt Lake City on the morning of June 4th, but she didn't make it. Her boyfriend called her cell phone, but his call went directly to her voicemail. Arias called her boyfriend that evening and explained she got lost and her cell phone had died. She said that she slept in her car for several hours. Arias arrived in Salt Lake City on the morning of June 5th, about 24 hours later than she was expected. Her boyfriend noticed she had 2 bandages on one of her hands. Arias said she had cut her hand at work. On June 7th, Arias dropped off her car at the place where she rented it from. The owner of the business was surprised to see she had driven nearly 3,000 miles. He also noticed some dark stains on the floor of the car. On June 9, 2008, some of Travis Alexander's friends went over to his home. The next morning, he was supposed to go to Cancun with his ex-girlfriend, but no one had heard from him in 5 days. His friends managed to get into his home. They immediately noticed a disturbing scent in the air. His friends went to his bedroom and they saw a large dried blood stain on the carpet. Travis's bedroom had its own bathroom. On the floor of a shower, they found the dead body of 30-year-old Travis Alexander. It was clear he had been brutally murdered. Travis's friends immediately called 911. The medical examiner thought that Travis had died from blood loss. He had been shot in the face with a .25 caliber handgun, stabbed 27 times, and his throat had been slit ear to ear. He had most likely died on June 4th, about 5 days earlier. The attack started in the bathroom, but he got away from his killer. He was most likely killed in the bedroom, and then his body was dragged and stuffed into the shower stall. The police searched Alexander's home. One thing that the police found was a box for a newly purchased camera, but the camera was missing from the box. They looked in the washing machine, and inside of it was the camera. The camera and the memory card inside of it were water damaged. Alexander's friends immediately suspected that Jodi Arias may have killed him. Arias was interviewed and she denied having anything to do with the murder. A computer expert with the police checked the memory card that was found inside the camera. The photos had been deleted, but he was able to recover them. They were taken on the day that Alexander was killed. Some of the photos were of Travis Alexander in the shower. This photo was taken at 5:29 p.m. and it is the last photo of Alexander alive. Another photo was taken at 5:31 and it appears to have been taken by accident. It is an out-of-focus photo of the ceiling. Another photo was taken 62 seconds later, and it's also believed that this photo was taken by accident. The investigators enhanced the photo, and they realized it was the back of Alexander's head, and blood was running down his arm. Another photo was taken, and it shows Alexander's dead body. The police were able to recover another set of photos from the memory card. They were taken about 4 hours before the shower photos. There were 4 nude photos of Jodi Arias in Alexander's bed. There were also 2 photos of Alexander in the bed. After seeing the photos, a detective asked Arias about the camera, and she claimed she had never seen it or touched it. The police looked at Arias' phone records and financial records. They thought it was odd that her phone had been turned off around the time of the murder. When the phone was turned back on, it pinged off a tower in Arizona, about 200 miles northwest of Mesa. The police also thought it was odd that Arias used her bank card before and after the murder, but there was no activity on her bank account during the 24 hours when the phone was shut off. A bloody palm print was found on the wall of Alexander's bathroom. It turned out that it was Arias' palm print, and it was a mixture of her blood and Alexander's blood. On July 15, 2008, about 5 weeks after the murder, Jodi Arias was arrested at her grandparents' home in Yreka, California. After a week in custody, Arias changed her story. She admitted that she did go to Alexander's home on the day of the murder, but she maintained she didn't kill him. She claimed that 2 people, a male and a female, wearing ski masks, broke in and killed him. Arias said that they grabbed her purse and got her address from her driver's license. They told her to get out and not tell anyone what she saw, or they would kill her and her family. The detective she told the story to did not believe her. A few weeks after Arias was arrested, she was extradited to Arizona. In jail, while Arias was awaiting trial, she sat down for several interviews with different news organizations. This included national television programs like Inside Edition and 48 Hours. In the interview with Inside Edition, she said that no jury would convict her because she was innocent. In all the interviews, she blamed the murder on the 2 home invaders. But then, in the spring of 2010, Arias had a news story about what happened on the day Alexander died. She said that there were no home invaders. She claimed that Travis Alexander had physically and sexually abused her. She said on the day he died, she acted in self-defense and shot him. After that, she blacked out and didn't remember what happened. She said she made up the story about the home invaders because she still loved Alexander and didn't want to ruin his reputation. Arias' lawyers tried to make a plea deal on 2 different occasions. She would have pleaded guilty to second-degree murder for a more lenient sentence. The district attorney rejected the plea deal both times. The opening arguments for Jodi Arias' trial for first-degree murder started on January 2, 2013. If Arias was found guilty, she could have been sentenced to death. By this point, the case had attracted a lot of media attention. One thing many people noted was the change in Arias' appearance. The media had described her as a blonde seductress before the trial. But at her trial, she had brown hair and wore glasses. Several members of the media said she looked like a teacher or a librarian. At the trial, Arias' defense lawyers argued that she acted in self-defense. They said she was taking photographs of Alexander in the shower and then she dropped the camera. Alexander became mad at her for dropping the camera and he lunged at her. She had simply defended herself. The prosecution had several of Alexander's friends testify. They said that Arias had become obsessed with Alexander. They compared her to the character Alex Forrest in the movie Fatal Attraction. In the 1987 movie, Alex, who is played by Glenn Close, becomes obsessed and stalks a man and his family after a one-night stand. The medical examiner testified and said that the wounds Alexander suffered were extensive. It was more like overkill than self-defense. He said that Alexander was probably stabbed in the heart first, but this didn't kill him right away. He tried to get away, and as he did, he was stabbed some more. It was only when he was lying on the floor, either dying or already dead, that he was shot in the head. Jodi Arias testified on her own behalf. Arias admitted that she had killed Alexander, but she said she had acted in self-defense. She claimed that Alexander was controlling and she had to do whatever he wanted. She also said he forced her to do demeaning sex acts. Arias also alleged that Alexander would become violent with her. She claimed he pushed her, slapped her, kicked her, and even choked her. Then, Arias accused Alexander of being a pedophile. She claimed she caught him masturbating to a picture of a young boy in briefs. Many people were disgusted by this accusation because there was no proof to support it. Alexander's home was searched thoroughly and no pictures or videos of underage children were found. Alexander's friends and family were disgusted by Arias' testimony because not only had she killed him and showed no remorse for it, but now she was trashing his reputation. Arias testified that Alexander became mad when she dropped the camera. She said that she shot him in self-defense and then blacked out. She did not remember doing anything else to the body. On cross-examination, the prosecutor painted Arias as a liar who was not to be believed. In total, Arias spent 18 days on the stand testifying. Jodi Arias' trial lasted 4 months. The jury deliberated for 15 hours over 3 days. She was found guilty of first-degree murder. She ended up being sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. At the time of this video, Jodi Arias is 40 years old and she is serving her sentence at the Arizona Department of Corrections Perryville in Goodyear, Arizona. Number 1. Harvey Glattman's photo collection. Harvey Glattman was born in December 1927 in the Bronx, New York. From a young age, he showed disturbing behavior. Notably, when he was just 4 years old, he liked to choke himself with a rope while he fondled himself. When Glattman was 10 years old, his family moved to Denver, Colorado. In junior high, he was teased because he had buck teeth and bad acne. Glattman was highly sexual but he was terrified of girls. Instead of talking to the opposite sex, he stayed in his room and he obsessed over pornography he had collected. He soon developed fantasies of humiliating and torturing women. When he was 12 years old, he started breaking into people's homes. During one of these break-ins, he stole a handgun. After stealing the gun, he followed several women home. Then, using the gun, he forced them into their bedroom and fondled their breasts. Over the next several years, Glatman was a peeping Tom. When he was 17, he got a bit bolder. He began approaching women on the street and pointing a gun at them. He would take them to isolated areas and undress them. He would then steal their purses and run away. He also started breaking into apartments. In May 1945, when he was 17, he was arrested breaking into the apartment of a woman. When he was arrested, the police searched him. He was carrying a length of rope and a .25 caliber handgun. He was charged with robbery and he was released from jail 3 days later after his parents paid for his bail. A month after he was arrested, he kidnapped a woman and drove her to a nearby canyon. He fondled her, but he did not rape her. Afterward, he dropped her off at her home. The woman went to the police and looked through mugshots. She identified Glatman and he was arrested again. Once again, he was released on bail. He ended up being sentenced to jail for a few months for the robbery charges and for assaulting the woman. In August 1945, while in jail, 17-year-old Glatman saw a psychiatrist. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia. In August 1946, he attacked a couple in Denver. He was armed with a cap gun that looked like a real gun. He tied up the young man and then sexually molested the woman. After attacking the couple, he fled to Albany, New York. Once there, he attempted to sexually assault a woman, but she managed to get away. Hours later, he found 2 other women and tried to sexually assault them. They also managed to escape from him. All 3 women went to the police and reported the attempted assaults. 2 days later, Glatman was arrested. He admitted he tried to sexually assault the first woman. In October 1946, he was sentenced to 5 to 10 years of prison. He was released after serving 2 years of prison and he returned to Denver to live with his parents. In 1952, Glatman discovered a mail-order business called Nutrix Publishing Company. They sent its members photos and cartoons of women in bondage. Glatman became obsessed with their imagery and sent them most of the money he made. Glatman soon got himself some camera equipment. He then hired models to pose for him in bondage scenes. After his first successful photo shoot, Glatman did more of them. In June 1957, Glatman moved to the Hollywood area of Los Angeles, California. He started taking a TV repair class and he got a part-time job servicing televisions and radios. Glatman was happy with his previous photo shoots in Denver, but it wasn't exactly what he wanted. He wanted to photograph a woman who didn't agree to be tied up. He wanted to see the fear in her eyes. On August 1st, 1957, Glatman arranged a photo shoot with 19-year-old Judy Dahl. Dahl was using her maiden name, Van Horn, for her modeling career. At the time, Dahl was divorcing her husband and he was fighting for custody of their 14-year-old child. Judy Dahl was an in-demand model who usually didn't do photo shoots with strangers, but she agreed to work with Glatman, who was using the pseudonym Johnny Glenn. Glatman picked her up at her apartment and took her back to his apartment. When they got into his apartment, he took out a length of rope and he told her he was going to tie her up. He told her that the photos were for a detective magazine. She reluctantly agreed to be tied up. After Glatman tied her up, he took some photographs. He then started fondling her. He took out a gun and he enjoyed how scared she looked. He then raped the 18-year-old woman. This is how 30-year-old Harvey Glatman lost his virginity. He then had Dahl sit with him on the couch and watch TV. He then took more photographs of her in bondage. When it got dark, he drove her out into the desert, 130 miles from Hollywood. He forced her to get out of the car and he tied her up. He then took more photographs of her. Then he had her get on her knees. He tied one end of a rope around her ankles and then tied the other end around her neck. He pushed her down on her stomach, and then he pulled up on the rope while he kept his foot on her back. This caused the rope to tighten around Dahl's throat, strangling her. When 18-year-old Judy Dahl was dead, he buried her in a shallow grave. When Dahl didn't come home that night, her roommates, who were also models, reported her missing. Dahl's remains were found on December 30th, 1957, but the police didn't know it at the time. They just knew it was the remains of a woman. In March 1958, using the name George Williams, Glatman joined a dating service. Through the service, he met 24-year-old mother of two, Shirley Bridgeford. On March 9th, Glatman and Bridgeford were supposed to go to a Western dance, but he convinced her to go on the drive and talk. Glatman drove 90 miles to Oceanside, California. Glatman parked in an isolated area and he tried to get physically intimate with Bridgeford, but she was not interested. Her lack of interest turned Glatman on. She then demanded to be taken home. Glatman started driving, but then Bridgeford realized he was heading in the wrong direction. He parked in another isolated area and forced her to get out of the car. He then pulled a gun on her. He made her get undressed and then he raped her. Afterward, he had her get dressed and then he forced her to get back into the car. He then drove to a remote area near Vallecito, California. He got her out of the car and bound and gagged her. As the sun was coming up, he snapped several photographs of Bridgeford looking terrified. He then strangled her in the same manner that he killed Judy Dahl. Shirley Bridgeford was reported missing when she didn't come home. In July 1958, Glatman found a freelance pinup model in the classified section of the newspaper named Ruth Mercado. Mercado was 24 years old. She had her own studio in her apartment where she would pose for professional and amateur photographers. Glatman set up an appointment with her on July 22, 1958. But when Glatman showed up, she said she wasn't feeling well, so she canceled the appointment. The next night, Glatman showed up at her apartment armed with a handgun. He forced his way into her apartment. Once inside, he tied up Mercado and then raped her. Afterward, he led her out to his car. He then drove her out to the desert, not far from where he killed Shirley Bridgeford about 4 months earlier. He kept her alive that night and throughout the next day, and he took several photographs of her in bondage. He then drove her over 30 miles to the Carrizo Plain. Once again, Glatman strangled his victim by tying a rope around her ankles and around her throat, and then pulling on the rope while stepping on her back. He then hid her body in some brush. In October 1958, Glatman called a model who had set up her own studio. The model got an uneasy feeling from him and chose not to work with him. But she did suggest a friend who was desperate to get work as a model. Glatman got in contact with her friend, 27-year-old Lorraine Vigil, and he offered her a modeling job. She accepted the offer. Glatman picked up Vigil on the night of October 27, 1958. Once they were outside the city, they parked on the side of the road. He pulled out a gun and tried to tie her up, but Vigil started screaming and fighting with Glatman. She grabbed his gun and it went off. The bullet grazed one of her thighs. Vigil continued to struggle, and she managed to get the driver's side door open. They both spilled out of the car. Vigil continued to fight for the gun, and after biting Glatman's wrist, she got the gun away from him. She aimed the gun at him and pulled the trigger, but the gun had jammed. Then, a police officer on a motorcycle pulled up on them. 31-year-old Harvey Glatman was arrested. After he was in custody, detectives searched his apartment. They found the photos of Judy Dull, Shirley Bridgeford, and Ruth Mercado. When Glatman was confronted with the photos, he confessed to the murders. He then led them to the bodies of Bridgeford and Mercado, and he told them that they had already found Dull's remains. In December 1958, Glatman pleaded guilty to the 3 murders. On December 18, 1958, he was sentenced to death. 10 months later, on September 18, 1959, 32-year-old Harvey Glatman was executed in the gas chamber in San Quentin prison. It's suspected that Glatman murdered other women besides the 3 he was convicted of killing. One possible victim was only known as the Boulder Jane Doe. Her dead body was found on the banks of Boulder Creek near Boulder, Colorado on April 8, 1954. It appeared she had been savagely beaten. In 2004, her body was exhumed and the medical examiner determined she had been hit with a car. In 2009, 55 years after her body was found, she was identified as 18-year-old Dorothy Gay Howard. Howard had disappeared from Phoenix, Arizona a few weeks before her body was found. Investigators suspect that Glatman ran her down as she tried to escape from him. At the time of Howard's murder, Glatman was 26 years old and he was living in the area and he was not in prison. Glatman was questioned about her murder after he confessed to the murders of the other 3 women. He denied killing her and any other women. He said, "Aren't 3 enough?" Number 3. Jessie McBain and Patricia Mann. Jessie McBain was born in Pittsboro, North Carolina on February 15, 1952. In high school, he started dating Patricia Mann. Mann was born on February 6, 1951, making her nearly a year older than McBain. McBain and Mann were popular in high school. McBain was voted most likely to succeed. After high school, McBain went to North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. Mann moved to Durham, North Carolina, and she became a student nurse at Watts Hospital. The couple had plans to get married. On February 12, 1971, Jessie McBain returned home to Pittsboro, where he picked up the car that he shared with his brother. He then drove to Durham and picked up his girlfriend, Patricia Mann. Mann had turned 20 6 days earlier, and McBain was going to turn 19 in 3 days. They went to a dance at Watts Hospital in Durham. At some point that evening, this photograph of the couple was taken. At about 11:30 p.m., McBain and Mann left the party together. Sadly, neither of them made it home that night. The next morning, Mann's roommate reported her missing. Initially, the police were not interested in investigating the disappearance of the couple. They thought that the couple might have just run off and eloped. Patricia Mann's friends decided to go look for her. They drove to an area that was being developed as a suburb. The roads had been made, but not many of the houses had been constructed. They found McBain's car, which was locked. After the car was discovered, the police realized that the couple may not have chosen to disappear. The police searched the car. In the car, they found the couple's jackets and Mann's purse. The car was checked for fingerprints, but the entire vehicle had been wiped down. On February 25, 1971, nearly 2 weeks after Patricia Mann and Jesse McBain went missing, their bodies were found by a surveyor. Their bodies were in some woods, a few miles from where their car was found, just over the county line. Their bodies were hidden under some leaves and debris. The bodies had been found because Mann's leg was sticking out from under the leaves. Mann and McBain had been tied to each other. Their wrists had been tied behind their backs with the same length of rope. The same piece of rope was then tied to a tree. Lengths of rope had also been tied around their necks. Both Mann and McBain were fully dressed, and there were no signs of sexual assault. It was apparent they had been tortured before they were killed. The markings on their neck indicated that they were strangled, and then the killer loosened the rope as they were losing consciousness. It appeared that the killer repeated this process several times before finally strangling them to death. Patricia Mann also had a ruptured liver. It's believed that she was either punched, kicked, or stomped on. The couple also had some stab wounds, but they appeared to have been done post-mortem. At first, the police thought that at least 2 people kidnapped the couple. After all, McBain was an athletic young man, and it would have been difficult for one person to keep control of both him and Mann. But the coroner was convinced that one person committed the murders. It is believed that the killer came across McBain and Mann in their car. The killer got Mann and McBain into the trunk of their car and then drove them to the tree where their bodies were found. The police followed up on several leads, but no arrests were made. It wasn't long before the case went cold. 4 decades went by, and not much progress was made on the case. In 2011, the case was reopened. Previous investigators developed 3 suspects who had never been cleared. The investigators who reopened the case settled on one of them as their prime suspect. The police have never publicly identified the suspect, except to say that he is a doctor who lives and works in Durham. In the podcast The Long Dance, they give several reasons as to why the detectives suspect that the doctor might be responsible for the murders. The first is that the doctor was known for his erratic behavior. At a former workplace, he slashed the tires of coworkers and brandished a gun. This is how the doctor first came to the attention of the police. The police received a profile of the killer from the FBI. The profile was printed in the newspaper, and the doctor's former employer thought that it sounded just like the doctor. So he reported the doctor to the police. The investigators who took over the case in 2011 checked the doctor's background and found several more reasons to suspect that he was the killer. 2 years after the murders of Jesse McBain and Patricia Mann, he allegedly tried to kidnap 2 male teenage hitchhikers. Supposedly, he got out of his car and pulled out a gun. He told the hitchhikers he was a police officer and he ordered them to get into his car. But neither teenager was intimidated by him and they got aggressive towards him. The doctor got back in his car and drove away. One of the hitchhikers reported the incident to the police. He gave them the attempted kidnapper's license plate. The police looked up the license plate and learned that it was registered to the doctor. The hitchhiker also picked the doctor out of a photo lineup. He was questioned by the police. He denied trying to kidnap the hitchhikers. He then said that he hoped that the police catch whoever tried to kidnap the hitchhikers. He said that it sounded like the same person who killed McBain and Mann. The doctor was never charged in connection with the attempted kidnapping of the hitchhikers. Besides the odd comment, something else caught the attention of the investigators. One problem the investigators had was how did the killer manage to overpower McBain and Mann? An explanation is that the killer could have been pretending to be a police officer and he was armed with a gun. Just like the doctor supposedly did with the hitchhikers. That was not the doctor's only run-in with the law. In 1995, the doctor attacked a woman in a road rage incident. The doctor punched her several times and she fell to the ground. After she fell to the ground, he kicked her at least 24 times while screaming and swearing at her. The doctor was eventually convicted of assault, but was ultimately overturned and the charges were dismissed. One last strange incident connects the doctor to the murders. In February 1996, around the 25th anniversary of the murders, Jesse McBain's mother got a strange phone call in the middle of the night. The call was made from a payphone about 1.5 miles from where the couple went missing. The caller said that he killed McBain. McBain's mother asked who he was, and the caller gave the doctor's name. The call was not recorded. It was never proven that the doctor made the phone call. The doctor has never been charged with the murder of the couple. That's because no physical evidence connects him to the murders. In the spring of 2018, the investigators were hoping that DNA might be found on the rope that was used to bind and kill the couple. Unfortunately, not enough DNA was found to create a profile. The doctor has refused to give a sample of his DNA. The doctor remains the prime suspect. At the time of this video, he is alive and he is still practicing medicine. The murders of Jesse McBain and Patricia Mann remain unsolved. Number 2. Timothy Hill. Timothy Hill lived with his parents in Mercer County, West Virginia. On May 14, 2014, he turned 18. That spring, he attended his senior prom and he graduated from high school. On the night of June 11, 2014, Timothy couldn't sleep, so he left his home on foot. He texted his friend, 15-year-old Wyatt Heslip, and asked him to meet up. When they met up, 18-year-old Christopher Collins was with Wyatt. The young man went and hung out for a couple hours. At around 11 p.m., after Timothy met up with his friends, a neighbor of the Hill family, Angela Gillespie, noticed some items were on her husband's state trooper cruiser. Her husband, B.D. Gillespie, had been a state trooper for 3 years. Angela went out to the cruiser and saw that the items were wet pairs of boxer shorts. She got in the car and she went looking for the people who threw the boxer shorts. She couldn't find them, so she returned home at about 11:30 and told BD about the boxer shorts. Trooper BD Gillespie then left his home and searched for the people who threw the boxer shorts. After 20 minutes of searching, he didn't find them. He returned home and he put on his state trooper's uniform. At 11:51 p.m., he put himself on duty and started looking for the pranksters in his cruiser. Just hours earlier, Senior Trooper Gillespie had finished a 14-hour shift. At about 1:30 a.m., nearly 2 hours after Trooper Gillespie left his home to look for the people who threw the boxer shorts on his vehicle, Timothy and his 2 friends were arriving back at his home. Trooper Gillespie pulled up to them and got out of his cruiser. He did not turn on his in-car recorder. Trooper Gillespie snapped this photograph of the young men. 18-year-old Timothy Hill is on the left, 18-year-old Christopher Collins is in the middle, and 15-year-old Wyatt Heslop is on the right. Trooper Gillespie questioned the young men and asked them if they threw the boxer shorts on his cruiser. All 3 young men denied doing it. But it turned out that Christopher Collins and another teenager were the ones who threw the boxer shorts on the cruiser. Wyatt was with them when it happened, but he didn't throw his boxer shorts. Christopher and his friend later claimed that they didn't specifically target Trooper Gillespie. His cruiser just happened to be the first car they encountered as they were walking back from a late-night swim. The other young man who threw his boxer shorts split from them shortly after tossing his underwear on the cruiser. Timothy Hill was not with them when the underwear was thrown on the car. After talking to the young men for a few minutes, Trooper Gillespie told Collins and Wyatt to leave. After he walked away, for reasons that were never made clear, Trooper Gillespie told Timothy to turn around because he wanted to put handcuffs on him. Trooper Gillespie claims that Timothy resisted, so he pulled out his mace. He sprayed Timothy from about 6 inches away. He also struck him in the head with his baton. Trooper Gillespie claimed that neither had an effect on the young man. A neighbor saw the struggle between the two and he ran over and asked Trooper Gillespie if he needed any help. As the neighbor got close, he felt the effects of the mace. Trooper Gillespie continued to struggle with Timothy, and it led to him, Timothy, and the neighbor falling into a water-filled ditch. The neighbor climbed out of the water first. Trooper Gillespie pulled out his gun. He shot Timothy once in the head and then again in the chest. After shooting the 18-year-old, Gillespie did not look for signs of life or try to provide medical aid. Instead, he left Timothy lying face down in the water. The paramedics found Timothy face down in the water when they arrived a few minutes later. Trooper Gillespie claimed that he shot Timothy because Timothy had been trying to pull the gun from his holster. The neighbor was questioned about the shooting. He said that he saw Timothy reaching for Gillespie's belt, but he did not see him reach for the gun. The neighbor also didn't witness the actual shooting. Trooper Gillespie was brought in front of the grand jury. They chose not to indict him. There was an internal investigation, and Gillespie was cleared of all wrongdoing. The Hill family was deeply upset by the shooting and the fact that Trooper Gillespie was not punished. They had several problems with this story. For example, why did Trooper Gillespie try to handcuff Timothy? Timothy wasn't under arrest or being charged with anything. Timothy was not acting aggressively. Also, Trooper Gillespie was much larger than Timothy. Trooper Gillespie was 6'3" and weighed 240 pounds, while Timothy was 5'9" and weighed 185 pounds. Timothy also wasn't armed with any kind of weapon. The Hill family also questioned why Trooper Gillespie put himself on duty. Was searching for someone who threw boxer shorts on his vehicle a valid reason to go on duty? He then spent 2 hours on duty looking for the pranksters. Was this an appropriate use of his on-duty time? Another problem was that the Hills had several run-ins with B.D. Gillespie and his wife. They lived on the same street. Gillespie's wife did not like people riding ATVs and dirt bikes around their home. The Hills claimed that the Gillespies would use binoculars and watch Timothy as he rode his dirt bike. They would also record him on camera. A few months before the shooting, when he was on duty, Trooper Gillespie stopped Timothy while he was riding his dirt bike. He told Timothy he wasn't allowed to ride his dirt bike in the neighborhood. Gillespie told people that Timothy swore at him and rode off. Timothy told his mother that Trooper Gillespie followed him after they talked. But Trooper Gillespie said that wasn't true and that Timothy followed him as he drove away. Trooper Gillespie claimed that he only talked to Timothy to be a good neighbor. But after the incident, Trooper Gillespie went over to the Hills' home and talked to Timothy's mother, Michelle. Michelle said that Trooper Gillespie told her that Timothy was a disrespectful young man and he should take him to jail. At the time, Timothy was 17, and he asked Michelle when Timothy would be turning 18. Michelle said that Gillespie had threatened to give her a ticket for setting out her garbage earlier than the designated time. Trooper Gillespie also apparently told Michelle that he could do whatever he wanted to people who caught his eye. The Hill family believes that Trooper Gillespie was bullying Timothy and he was out to get him. Gillespie's wife told investigators that before her husband went out searching for the pranksters, she told him that she thought that Timothy Hill might have been one of the people who threw the boxers. But Trooper Gillespie told investigators that he didn't even recall who Timothy was. He said that his wife had to remind him who he was. He also told investigators that he remembered talking to Timothy a while ago about the dirt bike, but he claimed that Timothy was respectful to him. This contradicts what Trooper Gillespie told people about the interaction with Timothy. He had previously claimed that Timothy swore at him and then followed his cruiser. The Hills sued Trooper B.D. Gillespie and the West Virginia State Police. The suit alleged that Gillespie, who should not have been on duty, searched for the pranksters for 2 hours. He was frustrated by the time he happened upon Timothy and his friends. Since he already had a vendetta against Timothy, he chose to focus on him that night. Trooper Gillespie used excessive force when trying to handcuff Timothy, and he was negligent when he killed him. In March 2017, a settlement was reached. The West Virginia State Police agreed to pay $700,000 to the family. The settlement did not include any admission of wrongdoing by the state police or Trooper Gillespie. At the time of the settlement, the Gillespies and the Hills still lived on the same street. The Hills said that nearly every day, B.D. Gillespie drives by their home. The Hills said that they have no plans to move. Number 1. Jeffrey Franklin. In early 1998, the Franklin family lived on Camelot Drive in Huntsville, Alabama. 48-year-old Gerald Franklin and his 44-year-old wife, Cynthia, had 5 children. Jeffrey was 17, Sarah was 14, Stacy was 11, Timothy was 8, and the youngest, Christopher, was 6 years old. At around 5 p.m. on March 10, 1998, Stacy was at dance practice. Gerald was also out of the home. Sarah was talking on the phone with her friend, who lived in the same neighborhood. The friend, who was a teenage girl, heard some strange noises. She also heard the family's dog barking, and then she heard a blood-curdling scream. Suddenly, the line went dead. The girl decided to go over to the Franklins' home and see what was happening. When she got there, she saw 8-year-old Timothy lying near the back gate. He was bleeding from the head. She saw some blood on the back door. Suddenly, 17-year-old Jeffrey emerged out of the back door. He was smeared with blood. Jeffrey grabbed the girl. She was able to fight him off, and she ran from the home. She called 911. Officers rushed to the scene, and Jeffrey took off in a car. He led the police on a 25-minute chase. It ended when he crashed into a fence. After he crashed, he was arrested. Back at the Franklins' home, the police found 48-year-old Gerald and 44-year-old Cynthia's dead bodies. 14-year-old Sarah, 8-year-old Timothy, and 6-year-old Christopher were in bad shape. They had all suffered severe head and neck injuries. They were all rushed to the hospital and listed in critical condition. The only family member who wasn't injured was 11-year-old Stacy. She had been at her dance class when Jeffrey attacked everyone. After Jeffrey was arrested, this photo of him smiling was taken. At the time, he's sitting in the back of a police car. As he's sitting there grinning, he most likely assumed that he had killed his parents and 3 of his siblings. As Jeffrey was being led into the police station, more photographs of him were taken. He was shirtless. It was clearly visible that Jeffrey had scratched a pentagram and a pitchfork into his chest and abdomen. He spat at a reporter, made faces, and yelled vulgar things to some of the women who were there. Franklin's 3 siblings underwent emergency surgery, and they survived their injuries. Franklin was interviewed by the police. He admitted that he was at home when the attack happened, but he claimed he didn't hurt anyone. He said that an evil being had taken over his body. The being had horns coming out of his head and eyes. Since Jeffrey wouldn't tell the police what he did, the investigators did their best to figure out what happened based on evidence at the crime scene. 44-year-old Cynthia was attacked first. Jeffrey was stabbed multiple times with a rat tail file. He then moved on to his 14-year-old sister, Sarah. Using a hatchet, he cut her throat and bludgeoned her. 48-year-old Gerald had been out of the house when the attack started. When Gerald walked in the door, Jeffrey killed him with a sledgehammer. Jeffrey then attacked his 2 brothers, 8-year-old Timothy and 6-year-old Christopher, with a hatchet and a butcher knife. What was a mystery was, why did Jeffrey Franklin attack his family? The police talked to friends and neighbors of the family. Everyone said that Jeffrey had been a nice guy up until about 2 years earlier. That's when he started acting strangely, and when he became fascinated with the occult and Satanism. Jeffrey had been diagnosed with ADHD, and he had been prescribed Ritalin. It turned out that Jeffrey had been abusing the drug. 12 days after Jeffrey was arrested, a blood test was done. His blood had about 10 times the usual amount of Ritalin. Jeffrey had written a lot before the attack. He detailed how he planned to kill his family and what he planned to do afterward. But in his writings, he did not give a reason as to why he wanted to kill his family. He just wrote that they had to die one by one. Jeffrey also wrote a lot about his fascination with the occult and Satanism. Jeffrey Franklin was scheduled to go to trial in June 2001. The district attorney was seeking the death penalty. There was some speculation that Jeffrey was going to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. But he had ruined that defense in his writings. He wrote, "Even if they do catch me, I will plead insanity and fool those stupid judges and prosecutors." The day before the trial was to begin, Jeffrey pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. He was given 3 life sentences. In Alabama, someone serving a life sentence could apply for parole after serving 15 years. So Jeffrey was able to apply for parole in September 2016. His request for parole was denied. Jeffrey will be able to apply for parole again in September 2021. At the time of this video, Jeffrey Franklin is 40 years old, and he is serving his sentence at the Bullock Correctional Facility in Union Springs, Alabama. Number 3. The Gladbeck Hostage Crisis. Gladbeck is a town in Germany. In August 1988, it was part of West Germany. On the morning of August 16, 1988, 32-year-old Dieter Degowski and 31-year-old Hans-Jürgen Rosna forced their way into a bank in Gladbeck. It was still early and there were no customers in the bank. But it wasn't long before the police surrounded the bank. There was a standoff, and the police started to negotiate with the 2 men. At the end of the day, the police agreed to let the 2 men leave with about $227,000 in Deutschmarks and a getaway car. That night, Degowski and Rosna left the bank with 2 hostages, and they got into the vehicle. After leaving the bank, they picked up Rosna's girlfriend, 34-year-old Marion Lobisch. They drove 140 miles to the city of Bremen. Once there, they tried to hire a car, but they were unable to. So they went to the local bus station and boarded a bus with 30 passengers and took them hostage. The media descended on the bus station. Several journalists even boarded the bus, where they took photos and recorded footage. They also interviewed the gunman and several hostages. Rosna, who was still armed, got off the bus and gave an impromptu press conference on the street. Rosna said he was prepared to end it all, and he even put the barrel of his gun in his mouth. But he didn't shoot himself, and he got back on the bus. Not long after Degowski and Rosna took over the bus, they forced the driver to drive out of the station. They set off towards Hamburg, which was 75 miles away. Along with the 30 passengers, 2 journalists had remained on the bus. The two hostages from the bank were also on the bus. Before they got onto the Autobahn, they released 4 elderly hostages and a child. On the Autobahn, they pulled over at a service station. The 2 hostages from the bank were then released. Also, Rezna's girlfriend, Marianne Lobish, got off to use the washroom. As she was exiting the washroom, the police grabbed her. When Nagovsky and Rezna realized that Lobish wasn't returning to the bus, they gave the police an ultimatum. They would have to release Lobish, or they would execute a hostage every 5 minutes. The police didn't release her, so Nagovsky shot 15-year-old Emmanuelle de Georgie 3 times in the head. Emmanuelle was on the bus with his little sister, and she witnessed the shooting. Several witnesses said that the intended victim was his sister, and Emmanuelle jumped in the way to save her. Emmanuelle was dragged off the bus by the 2 journalists. He was rushed to the hospital, but he died not long after arriving. After Emmanuelle was shot, Lobish was released, and she returned to the bus. The police had tried to release Lobish before the 5-minute deadline, but they had a problem with the handcuffs because the keys were broken. The bus set off again with police cars following it. As they drove, one police car collided with a truck, killing a police officer and injuring another. On August 18th at 2:30 a.m., the bus entered the Netherlands. The police in the Netherlands surrounded the bus. They refused to negotiate with Nagovsky and Rezna if there were children on the bus. So, at around 5 a.m., they released 3 women and 2 children. Several hours later, the German police provided Nagovsky, Rezna, and Lobish with a BMW. The trio and 2 hostages, Silka Bischoff and Ines Wattal, who were both 18, piled into the car. Bischoff was a trainee at a lawyer's office. On the day she was taken hostage, she had finished work and she had waited for an hour to take the bus with her friend Ines Wattal. Rezna and Lobish got into the front seat, and Nagovsky, Bischoff, and Wattal got into the back seat. At first, it appeared that they were heading to Amsterdam, and then they turned back and re-entered West Germany at about 7 a.m. It had been nearly 48 hours since Nagovsky and Rezna robbed the bank. To keep themselves going, they had been drinking beer and using amphetamines. After returning to West Germany, they drove to Cologne and parked outside of a shopping district. They were surrounded by dozens of journalists and onlookers. Several journalists interviewed Silka Bischoff as she sat in the car. The behavior of some journalists was utterly unethical. One of them noticed that Nagovsky's gun was on his lap. The reporter suggested putting the gun to Bischoff's head to make their footage more dramatic. A journalist in Cologne named Udo Rebel had not been working for the past 2 days, and he had not been watching TV or listening to the radio. So he only heard about the hostage drama that morning. Rebel went to the shopping district and pushed his way through the crowd. He managed to strike up a rapport with the trio of hostage takers. It was clear that they were starting to unravel mentally from the lack of sleep and the drugs and the alcohol. Rezna asked Rebel for directions to the Autobahn, but Rezna had a hard time remembering the instructions. So he asked Rebel to get into the car and direct him. Rebel agreed, and he got in the back seat next to Silka Bischoff. The Rezna pulled away from the crowd and drove towards the Autobahn. They got on the Autobahn and they started driving towards the city of Bonn. About 45 minutes after Rebel got into the car, Rezna pulled into a service station a Rabol got out. Then Rosna, Degowski, and Lobich and their 2 hostages got back onto the Autobahn. 2 hours later, the police rammed their car, leaving it immobile. This led to a shootout between the police and the gunmen. It ended with Rosna, Degowski, and Lobich being arrested. Rosna was shot in the thigh. 18-year-old Ines Vital was shot, but only received a minor wound. She had managed to get into a ditch and she survived the shootout. 18-year-old Sika Bischoff was not as lucky. She had been shot once in the heart and she died as a result of her wound. There are conflicting reports about who shot her, but the police said it was either Rosna or Degowski. The entire ordeal lasted 54 hours, and the trio traveled over 430 miles, and 3 lives were lost. In March 1991, Dieter Degowski, Hans-Jürgen Rosna, and Marion Lapuche were all sentenced for their roles in the deadly crime spree. Both Degowski and Rosna were given life sentences. Lapuche was given 9 years in prison. She ended up serving 6 years, and she was released. Dieter Degowski was released in August 2018 after serving 30 years in prison. Upon his release, he was given a new identity, and he now lives in anonymity. If he is still alive at the time of this video, he's 65 years old. Hans-Jürgen Rosna is still in prison, and it's not known when or if he'll be released. He is 64 years old at the time of this video. The police and the media were heavily criticized for their handling of the crisis. Number 2. The Beast of Jersey. Jersey is an island in the English Channel, not far from the northwest coast of France. At 45 square miles, the popular vacation spot is the largest of the Channel Islands. In the 1950s, Jersey was home to about 50,000 people. A horrifying crime spree began there in November 1957. A 29-year-old female nurse was waiting for the bus. She was attacked by a man with a face covering who dragged her out into a nearby field where she was raped. The woman went to the hospital afterward and she received several stitches, but she survived. Several months later, in March 1958, a 20-year-old woman was walking home after getting off a bus. A man came up to her and put a noose around her neck. She was dragged into a field and raped. She was released and she reported the attack to the police. In July 1958, August 1959, and October 1959, there were remarkably similar attacks. However, in the October 1959 attack, the 31-year-old woman was able to fight off her attacker. The victims all had similar descriptions of the attacker. He had a slight build, he was about 5'6", and he had a mustache. He was possibly in his early to mid-40s. He had an Irish accent. Finally, he had an unusual scent that many described as musty. Perhaps the attacker was emboldened by his failure because he started to commit more daring crimes. Early on Valentine's Day 1960, he broke into a home and he put a noose around a 12-year-old boy's neck. He led him outside and he raped him. In March 1960, a 25-year-old woman was walking to a bus stop. A man who claimed to be a doctor offered her a ride. She accepted and got into his car. He drove her out to a field where he beat her with his fist and then dragged her out of the car. In the field, he sexually assaulted her. He then forced her to get back into the car and he started driving. At some point, she managed to get out of the car and she started screaming for help. The rapist sped off. He committed one of his most notorious crimes in March 1960. A 43-year-old woman and her 15-year-old daughter were living in an isolated house. He cut their phone line and broke into their home. The woman heard someone in her home, so she went downstairs to investigate the noise. The man grabbed her and demanded any money she had. Unfortunately, the noise drew the 15-year-old girl out of bed and she came downstairs to see what was going on. This distracted the rapist and the woman ran from the house, leaving behind her daughter. The woman went to a neighboring farm, but no one was home. The woman ventured back home and discovered that her daughter had been attacked. A noose had been placed around her neck and she had been led out to a field where she was raped. All the victims said that the attacker was a man with an Irish accent and he had a musty smell. At this point, the residents of Jersey were in a panic and they demanded action. It wasn't long before a person of interest emerged. It was a 45-year-old eccentric man named Alphonse Legastois. Legastois lived alone in a rundown cottage. He was often seen walking around the island by himself. When Legastois was asked what he was doing on his walks, he said he just enjoyed nature. Legastois was interrogated by the police and he denied committing the attacks. The police found no evidence to connect him to the crime spree, so he wasn't arrested. In April 1960, a 14-year-old girl was asleep in her bedroom. When she woke up, she saw a man wearing a mask in her room. She screamed and the man ran away. A few months later, on July 30th, an 8-year-old boy was abducted from his home. The kidnapper was wearing a unique raincoat. The boy was sexually assaulted and brought back home. It's believed that the rapist stopped attacking people for the rest of 1960. Then on February 18, 1961, a 12-year-old boy was kidnapped from his home. He was led out of his home by a noose, but supposedly he wasn't sexually assaulted and he was returned home. Weeks later, on March 4th, an 11-year-old boy was awoken by a man strangling him with a belt. The boy managed to scream and the man ran away. In April 1961, an 11-year-old girl was kidnapped from her bed and raped in a field. At this point, the attacker had garnered a name, the Beast of Jersey. Many people still believe that Alphonse Legastois was the rapist. But the police had searched his home a dozen times and found nothing. Legastois was harassed by the islanders and vandals ransacked his home. Legastois maintained that he was innocent. In May 1961, Legastois exiled himself on a small island called Les Écriaux, which is about 6 miles northeast of Jersey. He reasoned that if he was away from Jersey and the attacks continued, it would prove he wasn't the Beast of Jersey. Around the same time that Legastois left the island, Scotland Yard became involved in the investigation. But their help did not lead to an arrest. For a year, there weren't any attacks. Then on April 19, 1962, a 9-year-old boy was abducted from his bed. He was raped in a field and then allowed to return home. The boy described his attacker by saying he was wearing a long overcoat and he had a musty smell. Then once again, the Beast of Jersey went quiet. It's believed that he struck again in April 1963 when he kidnapped and sexually assaulted a 9-year-old boy. Several months later, in November, an 11-year-old boy was attacked. Nearly half a year later, in July 1964, a 10-year-old girl was sexually assaulted. A month later, a 16-year-old boy was assaulted. The victim said he was wearing a long overcoat, a horrifying mask, and a wig of black hair. Scotland Yard started to collect fingerprints from people on the island. Eventually, they would collect prints from over 20,000 people, but they still didn't arrest anyone. It would be 2 years before there was another attack. In August 1966, a 15-year-old boy was raped by a masked man. Then, once again, the Beast of Jersey took a hiatus. Then in August 1970, a 13-year-old boy was kidnapped by a man wearing a mask, a wig, and a long coat. Like many of the other victims, he was taken to a field and sexually assaulted. Then again, there was a long stretch without an attack. On July 10, 1971, a police officer attempted to pull over a car that had run a red light. The driver didn't pull over, and he led the officer on a high-speed chase. He eventually turned onto a road that happened to be a dead end. The driver stopped, got out of the car, and ran. The officer gave chase and eventually tackled him. The man was identified as 46-year-old Edward Paynow. The officer noted that he was wearing wristbands that had nails sticking out of them. Also, his long overcoat had lapels with nails coming out of them. Edward's car was searched, and the officer found some suspicious items. This included a belt with a knife sheath, a flashlight, and several lengths of cord. But the most damning items were a mask and a black-haired wig. Edward Paynow was brought to the police station for questioning. Edward was a well-respected man on the island. He was a construction worker, and his wife, Joan, ran an orphanage. Edward and Joan had 3 biological children, and they had fostered several children. At the orphanage, Edward was known as Uncle Ted, and he would dress up as Santa Claus every Christmas and hand out toys and candy. Edward was questioned, and he was asked where he was going when he ran the red light. He said he had been on his way to an orgy. Edward continued to be interrogated, and finally, he admitted that he was the Beast of Jersey. The police searched his house, and they discovered a secret room hidden behind a cupboard in his home office. The investigators immediately noted that the room had a musty smell. In the room was an altar, and above the altar was a dagger pointing down towards a glass bowl. There was also a chalice full of cloves. There were several books on witchcraft and black magic. There was also a book about Gilles de Rais. De Rais was a knight who fought alongside Joan of Arc in the 15th century. After retiring from the military, it's believed that he engaged in a horrifying series of child murders. According to several historical accounts, his victim count is in the hundreds. After Edward was arrested, many photos were taken of his mask, wig, and coat. Sometimes officers would model them, and other times they were on mannequins. It was never clear why he wore the mask, other than to hide his identity. Some people believe he wore it for his own belief in black magic. Other people think he did it to terrify his victims. Edward Paynell went to trial in November 1971. Although it was suspected that he committed dozens of kidnappings and rapes, he was only facing 13 charges from 6 attacks. During the trial, it was revealed that Edward believed that he was a descendant of Gilles de Rais. The trial lasted 5 days, and the jury deliberated for 45 minutes. Edward Paynell was found guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to 30 years of prison. Edward's wife, Joan, claimed she never knew about her husband's crimes. They apparently hadn't slept in the same bed for years. She slept in the master bedroom, and he slept in his home office, which had the entrance to the hidden room. In 1972, Joan published a book about Edward called The Beast of Jersey. Joan and Edward eventually got divorced. In prison, Edward started a relationship with a woman. They got married in 1989 while he was still in prison. Edward Paynell served his entire 30-year sentence. He was apparently an ideal inmate. He was released in 1991 and he returned to Jersey. But for obvious reasons, people were deeply upset that he'd moved back to the island that he had terrorized for 14 years. So he and his wife moved to the Isle of Wight. Edward Paynell died 3 years after he was released from prison in 1994. He was in his late 60s. Number 1. The Luby's Cafeteria Massacre. This photo may just look like an auto accident. Accidents like this do happen from time to time. For example, a driver intends to park, but instead of hitting the brake, they put their foot on the gas pedal and drive into a storefront. But the story behind this photo is much more tragic. George Hennard was born in Pennsylvania in October 1956. His father was an army surgeon and his mother was a homemaker. Hennard had a tumultuous relationship with his parents. His father was described as tyrannical. His mother was an attractive woman who dressed younger than her years. Hennard initially craved his mother's attention, but that would change as he got older. His parents would argue often, and sometimes the fights turned physical. Hennard's family moved around a dozen times before he graduated from high school. Hennard never made any close friends, and he was a mediocre student. His favorite pastime was smoking marijuana and listening to rock music. He also played the drums, and he was in several bands. But he never lasted long in the bands. After graduating from high school in La Cruces, New Mexico in 1974, Hennard enlisted in the Navy. He served for 2 years, and then he was honorably discharged. He then joined the Merchant Marines. It was during this time that people noticed that Hennard had a horrifying mean streak. He was always angry, and he was extremely misogynistic. In 1989, after 15 years with the Merchant Marines, Hennard was fired. He was fired because a small amount of marijuana had been found in his cabin. By all accounts, this was an incredibly dark time in George Hennard's life. After losing his job as a Merchant Marine, he worked menial jobs but never stayed in one position very long. Hennard rarely dated. Instead, he preferred having sex with sex workers. It was well known that Hennard hated women, but the woman he hated the most was his mother. His relationship with her was volatile, and he often referred to her as a viper. In June 1991, Hennard paid a visit to the FBI. He claimed that a cabal of women was ruining his life. He said that they were spying on him and listening to his phone calls. He also said that they were talking to potential employers so he couldn't get a job. A few weeks later, Hernard moved into his mother's mansion in Belton, Texas, to be the caretaker. His mother wasn't living there and she was planning on selling it. During this time, Hernard repeatedly watched documentaries about mass murders. One mass murder he was obsessed with was the San Ysidro McDonald's massacre. In July 1984, 41-year-old James Huberty shot 21 people to death and wounded 19 more in a McDonald's in San Ysidro, California. His rampage came to an end when he was shot by a police sniper. At the time, it was the deadliest mass shooting by a lone gunman in American history. Hernard had even visited the site of the shooting. Hernard also became obsessed with the song "Don't Take Me Alive" by rock band Steely Dan. The song is about a killer who is holed up with a case of dynamite and the police have him surrounded, but the killer refuses to surrender. Hernard would listen to the song over and over again. On October 15, 1991, George Hernard celebrated his 35th birthday. He drank most of the day alone. The next morning, Hernard went to a local convenience store and bought breakfast. Hernard did this most days, but the store clerk noted that he was in a good mood for a change. He went home, and on a calendar, he wrote, "Life has become a stalemate. There's simply no hope and not a prayer." At 11:50 that morning, Hernard got into his pickup truck outside of his mother's home in Belton, Texas. He was armed with 2 semi-automatic handguns and more than 100 rounds of ammunition. Both guns and the ammo had been legally purchased. He drove to nearby Killeen, Texas. In Killeen was a Luby's Cafeteria. Luby's Cafeteria is a chain of cafeteria-style restaurants that are mostly located in Texas. October 16, 1993 was Boss's Day, so Luby's was busier than usual. That day, there were about 150 people in the diner for lunch. At 12:39 p.m., 35-year-old George Hernard drove his pickup truck through the plate glass window at the front of the restaurant. Hernard then started shooting from inside his truck. He then stepped out of his truck and started shouting something to the effect of, "This is what Belton did to me. Is it worth it? This is payback day." He then started shooting at both employees and patrons. He targeted women, but men were shot as well. One thing Hernard didn't do was target children. He even shouted, "Tell people I ain't killing no babies today." He shot many of his victims in the head to ensure that they died. The police were called and several officers arrived within minutes. A shootout between Hernard and the police ensued. Hernard was shot in the right forearm. The bullet went through his arm and ended up in his chest. He was then shot in one of his thighs. Hernard managed to get into a washroom. He put an end to the rampage by shooting himself in the right temple. He died on the washroom floor. The entire rampage lasted about 12 minutes. 22 people, 8 men and 14 women, died in the restaurant. Another woman died in the hospital. The victims ranged in age from 29 to 75. At least 20 other people were injured. With 23 people dead, Hernard set a new macabre record for most murders committed by a lone gunman in American history. His deplorable record would stand for 16 years until the Virginia Tech shooting in April 2007. Other than being an angry man, no one is sure why George Chouinard committed the mass murder. Nor does anyone know why he chose the Luby's cafeteria in Killeen to commit the massacre. Often, in the wake of mass shootings, people advocate for changes to gun laws. In contemporary times, there are usually calls for stricter gun laws. The Luby's cafeteria massacre was different. A 32-year-old woman named Susanna Hupp was in the restaurant having lunch with her parents, 71-year-old Al and 67-year-old Ursula Gracia. Hupp survived the shooting, but both of her parents were killed. That day, Hupp had a gun, but she kept it in her vehicle because bringing it into the restaurant was against the law. After the shooting, Hupp became an advocate for a person's right to carry a concealed weapon. In 1996, largely thanks to Hupp, it became legal to carry a concealed weapon in some places in Texas. That same year, Hupp ran as a Republican to be a state representative, and she won. She served 5 terms, and then she retired in 2007. The Luby's cafeteria reopened 5 months after the shooting. It remained open until September 2000, when it closed for business reasons. The building is now home to a Chinese food buffet.